Harper Audio presents The Drama of the Gifted Child by Alice Miller, read by Catherine Walker. A letter to the listener of the audio cassettes entitled The Drama of the Gifted Child. Dear friend, I feel that I owe you some explanation about the differences between the text of the book and the one you can hear on these cassettes. The story is quite simple, but it should be made clear to you. When I was asked to cut some pages for the text of the audio cassettes, I agreed to my publisher's request without hesitation. I saw no inconvenience in shortening the book and even welcomed the opportunity. Now, after having read it through for the first time since 1980, I realized that in addition to making some cuts, some changes were also unavoidable. This refers above all to everything that brings to mind the psychoanalytical language, which I totally rejected in my 6 later books. However, it seemed to me that a compromise was necessary, and I have finally not changed as much as I first wanted to, because I felt that in this book, my point of departure, my psychoanalytical heritage, should remain apparent. In my opinion, this book should retain what made it so helpful to others, the actual realization of my awakening. The process of my growing awareness, of questioning conventional opinions, of my gradual liberation from misleading concepts which, to a large extent, conceal the truth, all this should not be undermined by changes. The drama was my first step on the journey to the truth of my childhood that I have described in depth in the more recent books. But it is not surprising that so many readers can rather identify with this first step, as just they were able to find encouragement for their own awakening from the drama. Many people have written to say, I now know I do have the right to feel, to listen to myself, to question what was imposed upon me for decades, to reject what confused me, and to seek what I need. Above all, I need to see the truth so as to be able to live. In view of what I now know, I will dare to face up to it. Given the right to feel, I can discover my own past. Dear listener, I hope that these cassettes will encourage you on your journey of discovery, and I wish you every success in your search. Alice Miller. Vantage Point, 1990. Almost 10 years have passed since my first 3 books were published. The Drama of the Gifted Child, For Your Own Good, and Thou Shalt Not Be Aware. The facts and interconnections I then presented on the basis of my many years of practice have lost neither in validity nor, unfortunately, in immediacy. On the other hand, what has radically changed is my hopeful attitude toward psychoanalysis, from which, in 1988, I officially broke away by resigning from the Swiss as well as the international psychoanalytic associations. I was forced to take this step when I realized that psychoanalytic theory and practice obscure, that is, render unrecognizable, the causes and consequences of child abuse by, among other things, labeling facts as fantasies, and furthermore that such treatments can be dangerous, as in my own case, because they cement the confusion deriving from childhood instead of resolving it. 10 years ago, I was not yet so clear about this. My study of philosophy, as well as my training in and practice of psychoanalysis, having long prevented me from recognizing many facts. Only when I was prepared to end my repression, to liberate my childhood from the prison of pedagogic notions and psychoanalytic theories, when I rejected the ideology of forgetting and forgiving, allied myself with the abused child, and, thanks to my therapy, learned to feel, did I gradually discover my hitherto concealed history. I have described my path to this history and to my new insights in books published after 1985. The Untouched Key, 1990, Banished Knowledge, 1990, and Breaking Down the Wall of Silence, 1991. My first 3 books mark the beginning of this development, for it was only as I was writing them that I began systematically to explore childhoods, including my own. It was thanks to my work on these books, and later also thanks to the success of a carefully and systematically uncovering therapy, that I could see what, despite my critical attitude toward the drive theory, still had remained concealed from me during the 20 years of my analytical practice. I owe this information to my readers because I have learned from their letters to me that unfortunately some individuals, after reading my earlier books, decided to undergo psychoanalytical training or treatment, assuming that my views as expressed therein reflected the views of contemporary analysts. This assumption is completely erroneous and misleading. The teaching structure of psychoanalysis has remained unchanged over the past 10 years, and I have not met a single person who, having assimilated the insights of my books, would still be willing to describe herself or himself as a psychoanalyst. Nor, in my view, would this be possible, since a therapist who has gained emotional access to her or his childhood, a process that I regard as essential, cannot remain blind to the fact that it is precisely this access that psychoanalysis prevents at all costs. Whenever I am, frequently and mistakenly, described as a psychoanalyst, it is only because I do not always hear about it in time to correct such a notion. Although, understandably enough, I feel a desire to incorporate my fresh insights into the new editions of my first 3 books and to rework some passages, I decided against it in order not to obscure my further development. Thus I have to refer the reader to my later publications, in which possible questions and apparent contradictions are dealt with and clarified in detail. There, too, the reader will find material to substantiate the statements contained in this preface. The fight against the truth is gradually losing significance, now that the new therapeutic possibilities to which I allude in my most recent books have come into existence. For each person wishing to end her or his repression, they offer access to the truth. This puts paid to psychoanalysis, even if its practitioners are not yet aware of this because they are still confined within their system of self-deception. Many of those seeking help are beginning to look more carefully at their potential helpers and their views, and no longer uncritically subject themselves to treatment. After many years of analysis, however, it is very difficult ever to escape from the labyrinth of self-deception and self-accusation. It took me 15 years to accomplish this liberation process, from 1973, when spontaneous painting allowed me vaguely to sense the truth, until 1988, when I was finally able to articulate it completely. Patients and adepts at psychoanalysis, who in their circles are cut off almost hermetically from advance in knowledge, do not know, just as for years I did not know, that there is already a means of access to one's own childhood that is not, as is unfortunately very often the case, dangerous, confusing, haphazard, fragmentary, and irresponsible, but on the contrary, comprehensive, systematic, clarifying, helpful, and committed solely to the truth. How should they know this, when their teachers refuse to find out anything about it because this access to childhood fills them with fear? It is the fear of one's own history, of the truth of the naked facts that can be brought to light by this therapy. Sigmund Freud banished this fear by denying the possibility of a verifiable access to childhood reality and restricting the analyst's work to the field of the patient's fantasies. The Swiss therapist J. Konrad Stettbacher has described the therapy he developed and which I tested on myself in a work entitled Making Sense of Suffering. This therapy description can enable many people to approach their childhood step by step and to assimilate the knowledge they have banished, even on their own, without the help of a therapist. With the knowledge of one's own history, susceptibility to such irrational help as ideologies, speculations, and sacrosanct lies vanishes because blindness is no longer required as a protection from fear. Someone who has faced facts need no longer fear reality nor flee from it. This completely cuts the ground from under the power of pedagogy and of the psychoanalytical and philosophical speculations that conceal reality. It must give way to what is transparent and verifiable. Alice Miller, 1990. Preface. We live in a culture that encourages us not to take our own suffering seriously, but rather to make light of it or even to laugh about it. What is more, this attitude is regarded as a virtue, and many people, of whom I used to be one, are proud of their lack of sensitivity toward their own fate, and particularly toward their fate as a child. I have tried to demonstrate in my books why the disastrous belief that this attitude is a desirable one has been held so tenaciously, and to point out the tragic conditions it helps to conceal. Again and again, readers from a number of countries have told me with great relief that after reading The Drama of the Gifted Child, they felt for the first time in their life something approaching sympathy for the neglected, abused, or even battered child they had been once. They say they now have more self-respect than before and are better able to recognize their needs and feelings. It was my life you were describing in your book. How could you have known, I am often asked. How could I have known? Today I do not find it hard to answer this question. Today I know that it was not the books I read, it was not my teachers or my study of philosophy, nor was it my training to become a psychoanalyst that provided me with this knowledge. On the contrary, all of these together with their mystifying conceptualization and their rejection of reality prevented me from recognizing the truth for years. Surprisingly, it was the child in me, condemned to silence long ago, abused, exploited, and turned to stone, who finally found her feelings, and along with them her speech, and then told me, in pain, her story. Thus it was my story I was telling in the drama, and many people saw their own mirrored in it. In my fourth book, Pictures of a Childhood, I describe in greater detail how my encounter with this child came about once she had reappeared after long banishment, and how it happened that I was able to offer her the protection she needed in order to feel her pain and speak about it. I was amazed to discover that I had been an abused child, that from the very beginning of my life I had no choice but to comply totally with the needs and feelings of my mother and to ignore my own. My discovery also showed me the power of repression, which had kept me from learning the truth all my life, and the inadequacy of psychoanalysis, which even reinforced my repression by means of its deceptive theories. For I had completed 2 analyses as part of my psychoanalytic training, but both analysts had been unable to question my version of the happy childhood I supposedly had enjoyed. It was not until I started to experiment with spontaneous painting in 1973 that I was first able to gain access to the undistorted reality of my childhood. In the pictures I painted, I was confronted with the terror that my mother, a brilliant pedagogue, had inflicted on me in my upbringing. I had been subjected to this terror for years because no one close to me, not even my less severe father, was capable of noticing or challenging this form of child abuse. Had just one person understood what was happening and come to my defense, it might have changed my entire life. That person could have helped me recognize my mother's cruelty for what it was, instead of accepting it for decades, to my great detriment, as something normal and necessary. This part of my story, this lack of enlightened witnesses, may have been responsible for the attempts I have made in my books to provide information that would reach potential witnesses who would be of help to the suffering child. By witnesses, I mean people who are not afraid to stand up for children assertively and protect them from adults' abuse of power. In our society, with its hostility toward children, such people are still hard to find, but their number is growing daily. The spontaneous painting I began to do helped me not only to discover my personal story, but also to free myself from the intellectual constraints and concepts of my upbringing and my professional training, which I now recognize to be false, deceptive, and disastrous in its impact. The more I learned to follow my impulses in a playful way with colors and forms, the weaker became my allegiance to conventions of an aesthetic or any other nature. I did not want to paint beautiful pictures. It was not even my goal to paint good pictures. All I wanted was to help the truth to break through. In this way, when I finally confronted my own truth and was strengthened by it, I found the courage to see with ever-growing clarity how the conventional methods of psychoanalysis block the creativity of patients as well as analysts. This is what I have tried to portray in my books, for the sake of helping the victims of this process to become aware of what has been done to them, and of sparing them the arduous path of my search. For doing this, I have been the recipient of much gratitude, but I have also encountered much hostility. In the meantime, I had come to understand that I was abused as a child because my parents had experienced something similar in their childhood, but had learned, as had my analysts and teachers, to regard this abuse as upbringing, or treatment, or training for their own good. Because they were not allowed to feel, or consequently understand what had been done to them, they were unable to recognize the abuse as such, and passed it on to me in turn, without even the trace of a bad conscience. I realized that I could not change in the slightest my parents' and teachers' past, which had made them blind, but at the same time I felt that I could and must attempt to point out to today's young parents, and especially to future parents, the danger of misusing their power, that I must sensitize them to this danger and make it easier for them to hear the signals of the child inside them, as well as of children everywhere. This is something I can do if I help children, victims who have been condemned to silence and who have no rights, to speak. If I describe their suffering from their perspective and not from that of adults. For after all, it was from a child that I myself received crucial information, answers to questions which had gone unanswered throughout my study of philosophy and psychoanalysis, and which did not cease to preoccupy me in the years that followed. It was thanks to the pain of the child in me that I fully grasped what so many adults must ward off all their life, and I also realized why they fail to confront their truth, preferring instead to plan self-destruction on a gigantic, atomic scale, without even recognizing the absurdity of what they are doing. These are the same people who, like all of us, entered the world as innocent infants, with the primary goals of growing, living in peace, and loving, never of destroying life. I recognized the compelling logic of this absurdity after I found the missing piece of the puzzle, the secret of childhood, till then closely guarded. This discovery convinced me that if we are willing to open our eyes to the suffering of the child, we will soon realize that it lies within us as adults either to turn the newborn into monsters by the way we treat them, or to let them grow up into feeling, and therefore responsible, human beings. Alice Miller, 1986. Forward. If a fool throws a stone into the water, goes an old saying, even 100 sages can't bring it back. Here we have a perfect reflection of the despair of the bright in the face of stupidity. But an ingenuous child who still thinks in pictures might ask, isn't the world full of stones? So why should 100 clever people try so hard to get back this one? Why don't they look around? If they do, they might find all kinds of new treasures they can't see because they are so busy searching in vain in the water. This may well be the case with the word narcissism. The word has become part of everyday speech to such an extent, and perhaps more than any other scientific term, that it is difficult today to rescue it for scientific use. The more sincerely the psychoanalytic profession toils for a deeper understanding of the concept of narcissism and to elucidate and define it for scientific use, the more the word attracts people to use it in everyday speech. The result of all this is such multiplicity of meanings that it is difficult to use the word now to define a precise psychoanalytic concept. Now, narcissism, the ambiguous noun, can be used according to one's preference and need to project a variety of meanings: a condition, a stage of development, a character trait, an illness. Yet when used in its adverbial and adjectival forms, the word becomes more precise, for then it is possible to achieve some degree of complementary clarification. On top of all this, the ambiguity that characterizes the word narcissism, even in professional literature, is further complicated by the derogatory emotional overtone it receives in everyday use. For there, such meanings as in love with oneself, always thinking of oneself, egocentric, incapable of object love, have become attached to it. Even psychoanalysts are not always free of such judgmental, emotional use of the word, although they try for neutrality. Let us now examine some of these derogatory, judgmental words. What exactly, for instance, is egoism? The 15-year-old schoolboy Sigmund Freud wrote in his notebook of aphorisms that the worst egoist is the person to whom the thought has never occurred that he might be one. Many people, even in old age, do not reach the wisdom of the 15-year-old Freud, but truly believe they have no such needs of their own, simply because they are not aware of them. Our contempt for egoists begins very early in life. Children who fulfill their parents' conscious or unconscious wishes are good, but if they ever refuse to do so or express wishes of their own that go against those of their parents, they are called egoistic and inconsiderate. It usually does not occur to the parents that they might need and use the child to fulfill their own egoistic wishes. They often are convinced that they must teach their child how to behave, because it is their duty to help him along the road to socialization. If a child brought up this way does not wish to lose his parents' love, and what child can risk that, he must learn very early to share, to give, to make sacrifices, and be willing to do without and forego gratification, long before he is capable of true sharing or the real willingness to do without. A child who has been breastfed for 9 months and no longer wants to drink from the breast does not have to be taught to give it up. And a child who has been allowed to be egoistic, greedy, and asocial long enough will develop spontaneous pleasure in sharing and giving. But a child trained in accordance with his parents' needs may never experience this pleasure, even while he gives and shares in a dutiful and exemplary way, and suffers because others are not as good as he is. Adults who were so brought up will try to teach their children this same altruism as early as possible. With gifted children, this is an easy task, but at what cost? Taking a closer look, we no longer find the meaning of the word egoism so clear-cut and unequivocal. It will be much the same when we examine respect for others, which is often said to be missing in self-centered people. If a mother respects both herself and her child from this very day onward, she will never need to teach him respect for others. He will, of course, take both himself and others seriously. He couldn't do otherwise. But a mother who, as a child, was herself not taken seriously by her mother as the person she really was, will crave this respect from her child as a substitute, and she will try to get it by training him to give it to her. The tragic fate that is the result of such training and such respect is described in this book. As soon as we look more closely and examine their origins, we shall see that other moralizing, derogatory words also will lose their popular, clear-cut character. The usually accepted judgmental contrast between self-love and object love, and their portrayal as opposites, springs from naive and uncritical usage in our everyday language. Yet a little reflection soon shows how inconceivable it is really to love others, not merely to need them, if one cannot love oneself as one really is. And how could a person do that if from the very beginning he has had no chance to experience his true feelings and to learn to know himself? For the majority of sensitive people, the true self remains deeply and thoroughly hidden. But how can you love something you do not know, something that has never been loved? So it is that many a person lives without any notion of his or her true self. Such people are enamored of an idealized, conforming, false self. They will shun their hidden and lost true self, unless depression makes them aware of its loss, or psychosis confronts them harshly with that true self, whom they now have to face and to whom they are delivered up helplessly as to a threatening stranger. In the following pages, I am trying to come closer to the origins of this loss of the self. While doing so, I shall not use the term narcissism. However, in my clinical descriptions, I shall speak occasionally of a healthy narcissism and depict the ideal case of a person who is genuinely alive, with free access to the true self and his authentic feelings. I shall contrast this with narcissistic disorders, with the true self's solitary confinement within the prison of the false self. This I see less as an illness than as a tragedy. And it is my aim in this book to break away from judgmental, isolating, and therefore discriminating terminology. As I think back over my last 20 years' work in the light of my present understanding, I can find no patient whose ability to experience his true feelings was not seriously impaired. Yet without this basic ability, all our work with the patient's instinctual conflicts is illusory. We might increase his intellectual knowledge, and in some circumstances strengthen his resistance, but we shall not touch the world of his feelings. In Thou Shalt Not Be Aware, in 1984, I wrote, "When I wrote the drama, I still thought I could reconcile my own findings with Freud's drive theory. I considered my approach to the treatment of narcissistic disorders as preliminary work that had to be performed with many patients before conflict neuroses could be addressed. But the more thought I give now to the theoretical consequences of my findings, and the more carefully and impartially I test the empirical content of the traditional theories, the more clearly their function in the total structure of social repression emerges for me. As a result, I have become more and more suspicious of the validity of Freudian drive theory, and have experienced a growing need to distinguish between it and my own views. See also my book, For Your Own Good, 1983, for further remarks on this subject. Chapter 1. The Drama of the Gifted Child and the Psychotherapist's Narcissistic Disturbance. Experience has taught us that we have only one enduring weapon in our struggle against mental illness: the emotional discovery and emotional acceptance of the truth in the individual and unique history of our childhood. Is it possible, then, with the help of psychoanalysis, to free ourselves altogether from illusions? History demonstrates that they sneak in everywhere, that every life is full of them, perhaps because the truth often would be unbearable. And yet, for many people, the truth is so essential that they must pay dearly for its loss with grave illness. On the path of analysis, we try, in a long process, to discover our own personal truth. This truth always causes much pain before giving us a new sphere of freedom, unless we content ourselves with already conceptualized intellectual wisdom. But then we shall remain in the sphere of illusion and self-deception. There is one taboo that has withstood all the recent efforts at demystification: the idealization of mother love. The usual run of biographies illustrates this very clearly. In reading the biographies of famous artists, for example, one gains the impression that their lives began at puberty. Before that, we are told they had a happy, contented, or untroubled childhood, or one that was full of deprivation or very stimulating. But what a particular childhood really was like does not seem to interest these biographers, as if the roots of a whole life were not hidden and entwined in its childhood. I should like to illustrate this with a simple example. Henry Moore describes in his memoirs how, as a small boy, he massaged his mother's back with an oil to soothe her rheumatism. Reading this suddenly threw light for me on Moore's sculptures, the great reclining women with the tiny heads. I now could see in them the mother through the small boy's eyes, with the head high above in diminishing perspective and the back close before him and enormously enlarged. This may be irrelevant for many art critics, but for me it demonstrates how strongly a child's experiences may endure in his unconscious, and what possibilities of expression they may awaken in the adult who is free to give them rein. Now, Moore's memory was not harmful, and so could survive intact. But every childhood's conflictual experiences remain hidden and locked in darkness, and the key to our understanding of the life that follows is hidden away with them. Sometimes I ask myself whether it will ever be possible for us to grasp the extent of the loneliness and desertion to which we were exposed as children, and hence intrapsychically still are exposed as adults. Here I do not mean to speak primarily of cases of obvious desertion by or separation from the parents, though this, of course, can have traumatic results. Nor am I thinking of children who were obviously uncared for or totally neglected, and who were always aware of this, or at least grew up with the knowledge that it was so. Apart from these extreme cases, there are large numbers of people who suffer from narcissistic disorders who often had sensitive and caring parents from whom they received much encouragement. Yet these people are suffering from severe depressions. They enter analysis in the belief, with which they grew up, that their childhood was happy and protected. Quite often we are faced here with gifted patients who have been praised and admired for their talents and their achievements. Almost all of them were toilet trained in the first year of their infancy, and many of them, at the age of 1.5 to 5, had helped capably to take care of their younger siblings. According to prevailing general attitudes, these people, the pride of their parents, should have had a strong and stable sense of self-assurance. But exactly the opposite is the case. In everything they undertake, they do well, and often excellently. They are admired and envied. They are successful whenever they care to be, but all to no avail. Behind all this lurks depression, the feeling of emptiness and self-alienation, and a sense that their life has no meaning. These dark feelings will come to the fore as soon as the drug of grandiosity fails, as soon as they are not on top, not definitely the superstar, or whenever they suddenly get the feeling they failed to live up to some ideal image and measure they feel they must adhere to. Then they are plagued by anxiety or deep feelings of guilt and shame. What are the reasons for such disturbances in these gifted people? In the very first interview, they will let the listener know that they have had understanding parents, or at least one such, and if they ever lacked understanding, they felt that the fault lay with them and with their inability to express themselves appropriately. They recount their earliest memories without any sympathy for the child they once were, and this is the more striking since these patients not only have a pronounced introspective ability, but they are also able to empathize well with other people. Their relationship to their own childhood's emotional world, however, is characterized by lack of respect, compulsion to control, manipulation, and a demand for achievement. Very often they show disdain and irony, even derision and cynicism. In general, there is a complete absence of real emotional understanding or serious appreciation of their own childhood vicissitudes, and no conception of their true needs, beyond the need for achievement. The internalization of the original drama has been so complete that the illusion of a good childhood can be maintained. In order to lay the groundwork for a description of these patients' psychic climate, I first will formulate some basic assumptions, which will provide us with a starting point. The child has a primary need to be regarded and respected as the person he really is at any given time, and as the central actor in his own activity. We are speaking here of a need whose fulfillment is essential for the development of a healthy self-esteem. When we speak here of the person he really is at any given time, we mean emotions, sensations, and their expression from the first day onward. In an atmosphere of respect and tolerance for his feelings, the child, in the phase of separation, will be able to give up symbiosis with the mother and accomplish the steps toward individuation and autonomy. If they are to furnish these prerequisites for a healthy self-esteem, the parents themselves ought to have grown up in such an atmosphere. Parents who did not experience this climate as children are themselves narcissistically deprived. Throughout their lives, they are looking for what their own parents could not give them at the correct time, the presence of a person who is completely aware of them and takes them seriously, who admires and follows them. This search, of course, can never succeed fully, since it relates to a situation that belongs irrevocably to the past, namely to the time when the self was first being formed. Nevertheless, a person with this unsatisfied and unconscious, because repressed, need is compelled to attempt its gratification through substitute means. The most appropriate objects for gratification are a parent's own children. A newborn baby is completely dependent on his parents, and since their caring is essential for his existence, he does all he can to avoid losing them. From the very first day onward, he will muster all his resources to this end, like a small plant that turns toward the sun in order to survive. So far, I have stayed in the realm of more or less well-known facts. The following thoughts are derived more from observations made in the course of therapies I have conducted or supervised, and also from interviews with candidates for the psychoanalytic profession. In my work with all these people, I found that every one of them has a childhood history that seems significant to me. There was a mother who at the core was emotionally insecure and who depended for her narcissistic equilibrium on the child behaving or acting in a particular way. This mother was able to hide her insecurity from the child and from everyone else behind a hard, authoritarian, and even totalitarian facade. This child had an amazing ability to perceive and respond intuitively, that is, unconsciously, to this need of the mother or of both parents for him to take on the role that had unconsciously been assigned to him. This role secured love for the child, that is, his parents' narcissistic cathexis. He could sense that he was needed, and this, he felt, guaranteed him a measure of existential security. This ability is then extended and perfected. Later, these children not only become mothers, confidants, comforters, advisors, supporters of their own mothers, but also take over the responsibility for their siblings and eventually develop a special sensitivity to unconscious signals manifesting the needs of others. No wonder that they often choose the psychoanalytic profession later on. Who else, without this previous history, would muster sufficient interest to spend the whole day trying to discover what is happening in another person's unconscious? But the development and perfecting of this differentiated sensorium, which once assisted the child in surviving and now enables the adult to pursue his strange profession, also contains the roots of his disturbance. By mother, I here understand the person closest to the child during the first years of life. This need not be the biological mother, nor even a woman. In the course of the past 20 years, quite often the fathers have assumed this mothering function. The phenomenology of narcissistic disturbance is well known today. On the basis of my experience, I would think that its etiology is to be found in the infant's early emotional adaptation. In any case, the child's needs for respect, echoing, understanding, sympathy, and mirroring suffer a very special fate as a result of this early adaptation. First, one serious consequence of this early adaptation is the impossibility of consciously experiencing certain feelings of his own, such as jealousy, envy, anger, loneliness, impotence, anxiety, either in childhood or later in adulthood. This is all the more tragic, since we are here concerned with people who are capable of differentiated feelings. This is noticeable at those times when they describe childhood experiences that were free of conflict. Usually, these concern experiences with nature, which they could enjoy without hurting the mother or making her feel insecure, without reducing her power or endangering her equilibrium. But it is remarkable how these attentive, lively, and sensitive children who can, for example, remember exactly how they discovered the sunlight in bright grass at the age of 4, yet at 8 might be unable to notice anything or to show any curiosity about the pregnant mother, or similarly were not at all jealous at the birth of a sibling. Again, at the age of 2, one of them could be left alone while soldiers forced their way into the house and searched it, and she had been good, suffering this quietly and without crying. They have all developed the art of not experiencing feelings, for a child can only experience her feelings when there is somebody there who accepts her fully, understands and supports her. If that is missing, if the child must risk losing the mother's love or that of her substitute, then she cannot experience these feelings secretly, just for herself, but fails to experience them at all. But nevertheless, something remains. Throughout their later life, these people unconsciously create situations in which these rudimentary feelings may awaken, but without the original connection ever becoming clear. Take, for example, the feeling of being abandoned, not that of the adult, who feels lonely and therefore takes tablets or drugs, goes to the movies, visits friends, or telephones unnecessarily in order to bridge the gap somehow. No, I mean the original feeling in the small infant who had none of these chances of distraction and whose communication, verbal or pre-verbal, did not reach the mother. This was not the case because his mother was bad, but because she herself was deprived, dependent on a specific echo from the child that was so essential to her, for she herself was a child in search of an object that could be available to her. However paradoxical this may seem, a child is at the mother's disposal. A child cannot run away from her, as her own mother once did. A child can be so brought up that it becomes what she wants it to be. A child can be made to show respect. She can impose her own feelings on him, see herself mirrored in his love and admiration, and feel strong in his presence. But when he becomes too much, she can abandon that child to a stranger. The mother can feel herself the center of attention, for her child's eyes follow her everywhere. When a woman had to suppress and repress all these needs in relation to her own mother, they rise from the depth of her unconscious and seek gratification through her own child, however well-educated and well-intentioned she may be, and however much she is aware of what a child needs. The child feels this clearly, and very soon forgoes the expression of his own distress. Later, when these feelings of being deserted begin to emerge in the therapy of the adult, they are accompanied by such intensity of pain and despair that it is quite clear these people could not have survived so much pain. That would only have been possible in an empathetic, attentive environment, and this they lacked. All the pain had to be warded off. But to say that it was absent would be a denial of the empirical evidence we have gained in therapy. Several sorts of mechanisms can be recognized in the defense against early feelings of abandonment. In addition to simple denial, there is reversal. I am breaking down under the constant responsibility because the others need me ceaselessly. Changing passive suffering into active behavior. I must quit women as soon as I feel that I am essential to them. Projection onto other objects, and introjection of the threat of loss of love. I must always be good and measure up to the norm, then there is no risk. I constantly feel that the demands are too great, but I cannot change that. I must always achieve more than others. Intellectualization is very commonly met, since it is a defense mechanism of great reliability. All these defense mechanisms are accompanied by repression of the original situation and the emotions belonging to it, which can only come to the surface after years of therapy. Second, accommodation to parental needs often, but not always, leads to the as-if personality, to a false self. This person develops in such a way that he reveals only what is expected of him and fuses so completely with what he reveals that one could scarcely have guessed how much more there is to him behind this masked view of himself. He cannot develop and differentiate his true self because he is unable to live it. It remains in a state of non-communication, as Winnicott has expressed it. Understandably, these patients complain of a sense of emptiness, futility, or homelessness, for the emptiness is real. A process of emptying, impoverishment, and partial killing of his potential actually took place when all that was alive and spontaneous in him was cut off. In childhood, these people have often had dreams in which they experience themselves as partly dead. I should like to give 3 examples. My younger siblings are standing on a bridge and throw a box into the river. I know that I am lying in it, dead, and yet I hear my heart beating. At this moment, I always wake. A recurrent dream. This dream combines her unconscious aggression, envy, and jealousy against the younger siblings for whom the patient was always a caring mother, with killing her own feelings, wishes, and demands by means of reaction formation. Another patient dreamed, I see a green meadow on which there is a white coffin. I am afraid that my mother is in it, but I open the lid, and luckily, it is not my mother, but me. If this patient had been able as a child to express his disappointment with his mother, to experience his rage and anger, he could have stayed alive. But that would have led to the loss of his mother's love, and that for a child is the same as object loss and death. So he killed his anger, and with it a part of himself in order to preserve his self-object, the mother. A young girl used to dream, I am lying on my bed, I am dead, my parents are talking and looking at me, but they don't realize that I am dead. Third, the difficulties inherent in experiencing and developing one's own emotions lead to bond permanence, which prevents individuation, in which both parties have an interest. The parents have found in their child's false self the confirmation they were looking for, a substitute for their own missing structures. The child, who has been unable to build up his own structures, is first consciously and then unconsciously, through the introject, dependent on his parents. He cannot rely on his own emotions, has not come to experience them through trial and error, has no sense of his own real needs, and is alienated from himself to the highest degree. Under these circumstances, he cannot separate from his parents, and even as an adult, he is still dependent on affirmation from his partner, from groups, or especially from his own children. The heirs of the parents are the introjects, from whom the true self must remain concealed, and so loneliness in the parental home is later followed by isolation within the self. Narcissistic cathexis of her child by the mother does not exclude emotional devotion. On the contrary, she loves the child as her self-object excessively, though not in the manner that he needs, and always on the condition that he presents his false self. This is no obstacle to the development of intellectual abilities, but it is one to the unfolding of an authentic emotional life. How can psychotherapy be of help here? The harmony depicted in Küchen von Heilbrunn, Heinrich von Kleist's romantic heroine, in the drama of the same name, 1810, is probably only possible in fantasy, and particularly understandable arising from the longing of such a narcissistically tormented person as Kleist. The simplicity of Shakespeare's Falstaff, of whom Freud is reported to have said that he embodied the sadness of healthy narcissism, is neither possible nor desirable for these patients. The paradise of pre-ambivalent harmony, for which so many patients hope, is unattainable. But the experience of one's own truth and the post-ambivalent knowledge of it makes it possible to return to one's own world of feelings at an adult level, without paradise, but with the ability to mourn. It is one of the turning points when the narcissistically disturbed patient comes to the emotional insight that all the love he has captured with so much effort and self-denial was not meant for him as he really was, that the admiration for his beauty and achievements was aimed at this beauty and these achievements, and not at the child himself. The small and lonely child that is hidden behind his achievements wakes up and asks, "What would have happened if I had appeared before you, bad, ugly, angry, jealous, lazy, dirty, smelly? Where would your love have been then? And I was all these things as well. Does this mean that it was not really me whom you loved, but only what I pretended to be? The well-behaved, reliable, empathetic, understanding, and convenient child, who in fact was never a child at all? What became of my childhood? Have I not been cheated out of it? I can never return to it. I can never make it up. From the beginning, I have been a little adult. My abilities, were they simply misused?" These questions are accompanied by much grief and pain, but the result always is a new authority that is being established in the patient, like a heritage of the mother who never existed, a new empathy with his own fate, born out of mourning. At this point, one patient dreamed that he killed a child 30 years ago, and no one had helped him to save it. 30 years earlier, those around him had noticed that this child became totally reserved, polite, and good, and no longer showed any emotional reactions. Now the patient does not make light of manifestations of his self anymore, does not laugh or jeer at them, even if he still unconsciously passes them over or ignores them in the same subtle way that his parents dealt with the child before he had any words to express his needs. Then fantasies of grandeur will be revived too, which had been deprecated and so split off. And now we can see their relation to the frustrated and repressed needs for attention, respect, understanding, for echoing and mirroring. At the center of these fantasies, there is always a wish that the patient could never have accepted before. For example, I am in the center, my parents are taking notice of me and are ignoring their own wishes. Fantasy, I am the princess, attended by my servants. My parents understand when I try to express my feelings and do not laugh at me, and no longer showed any emotional reactions. Now the patient does not make light of manifestations of his self anymore, does not laugh or jeer at them, even if he still unconsciously passes them over or ignores them in the same subtle way that his parents dealt with the child before he had any words to express his needs. Then fantasies of grandeur will be revived too, which had been deprecated and so split off. And now we can see their relation to the frustrated and repressed needs for attention, respect, understanding, for echoing and mirroring. At the center of these fantasies, there is always a wish that the patient could never have accepted before. For example, I am in the center, my parents are taking notice of me and are ignoring their own wishes. Fantasy, I am the princess, attended by my servants. My parents understand when I try to express my feelings and do not laugh at me. Fantasy, I am a famous artist and everyone takes me seriously, even those who don't understand me. My parents are rich in talents and courage and not dependent on my achievements. They do not need my comfort nor my smile. They are king and queen. This would mean for the child, I can be sad or happy whenever anything makes me sad or happy. I don't have to look cheerful for someone else, and I don't have to express my distress or anxiety to fit other people's needs. I can be angry and no one will die or get a headache because of it. I can rage and smash things without losing my parents. In D.W. Winnicott's words, I can destroy the object, and it will survive. Once these grandiose fantasies, often accompanied by obsessional or perverse phenomena, have been experienced and understood as the alienated form of these real and legitimate needs, the split can be overcome and integration can follow. What is the chronological course? First, in the majority of cases, it is not difficult to point out to the patient early in his therapy the way he has dealt with his feelings and needs, and that this was a question of survival for him. It is a great relief to him that things he was accustomed to choke off can be recognized and taken seriously. The therapist can use the material the patient presents to show him how he treats his feelings with ridicule and irony, tries to persuade himself they do not exist, belittles them, and either does not become aware of them at all, or only after several days when they have already passed. Gradually, the patient himself realizes how he is forced to look for distraction when he is moved, upset, or sad. When his 6-year-old's mother died, his aunt told him, "You must be brave, don't cry, now go to your room and play nicely." There are still many situations where he sees himself as other people see him, constantly asking himself what impression he is making and how he ought to be reacting or what feelings he ought to have. But on the whole, he feels much freer in this initial period, and thanks to the therapist as his auxiliary ego, he can be more aware of himself when his immediate feelings are experienced within the session and taken seriously. He is very grateful for this possibility, too. Second, this will, of course, change. In addition to this first function, which will continue for a long time, the therapist must take on a second as soon as the transference neurosis has developed, that of being the transference figure. Feelings out of various periods of childhood come to the surface then. This is the most difficult stage in therapy, when there is the most acting out. The patient begins to articulate and breaks with his former compliant attitudes, but because of his early experience, he cannot believe this is possible without mortal danger. The compulsion to repeat leads him to provoke situations where his fear of object loss, rejection, and isolation has a basis in present reality, situations into which he drags the therapist with him, as a rejecting or demanding mother, for example, so that afterward he can enjoy the relief of having taken the risk and been true to himself. This can begin quite harmlessly. The patient is surprised by feelings that he would rather not have recognized, but now it is too late. Awareness of his own impulses has already been aroused, and there is no going back. Now the person must, and also is allowed to, experience himself in a way he had never before thought possible. Whereas this patient had always despised miserliness, he suddenly catches himself reckoning up the 2 minutes lost to his session through a telephone call. Whereas he had previously never made demands himself and had always been tireless in fulfilling the demands of others, now he is suddenly furious that his therapist is going away on vacation, or he is annoyed to see other people waiting outside the consulting room. What can this be? Surely not jealousy. That is an emotion he does not recognize. And yet, what are they doing here? Do others besides me come here? He had never realized that before. At first, it is mortifying to see that he is not only good, understanding, tolerant, controlled, and above all adult, for this was always the basis for his self-respect, but another, weightier mortification is added to the first when this person discovers the introjects within himself, and that he has been their prisoner. For his anger, demands, and avarice do not at first appear in a tamed adult form, but in the childish, archaic one in which they were repressed. The patient is horrified when he realizes that he is capable of screaming with rage in the same way that he so hated in his father, or that only yesterday he has checked and controlled his child, practically, he says, in my mother's clothes. This revival of the introjects and learning to come to terms with them with the help of the transference forms the major part of the therapy. What cannot be recalled is unconsciously reenacted and thus indirectly discovered. The more he is able to admit and experience these early feelings, the stronger and more coherent the patient will feel. This in turn enables him to expose himself to emotions that well up out of his earliest childhood and to experience the helplessness and ambivalence of that period. There's a big difference between having ambivalent feelings towards someone as an adult and after working back through much of one's previous history, suddenly experiencing oneself as a 2-year-old who is being fed by the maid in the kitchen and thinking in despair, "Why does Mother go out every evening? Why does she not take pleasure in me? What is wrong with me that she prefers to go to other people? What can I do to make her stay at home? Just don't cry. Just don't cry." The child could not have thought in these words at the time, but in the session on the couch, this man was both an adult and a 2-year-old child, and could cry bitterly. It was not only a cathartic crying, but rather the integration of his earlier longing for his mother, which until now he had always denied. In the following weeks, the patient went through all the torments of his ambivalence toward his mother, who was a successful pediatrician. Her previously frozen portrait melted into the picture of a woman with lovable aspects, but who had not been able to give her child any continuity in their relationship. "I hated these beasts who were constantly sick and always taking my mother away from me. I hated my mother because she preferred being with them to being with me." In the transference, clinging tendencies and feelings of helplessness were mingled with long dammed-up rage against the mother, who had not been available to him. As a result, the patient could rid himself of a perversion that had tormented him for a long time. Its point was now easy to understand. His relationships to women lost their marked characteristics of narcissistic cathexis, and his compulsion first to conquer and then to desert them disappeared completely. At this stage in the therapy, the patient experienced his early feelings of helplessness, of anger, and of being at the mercy of the loved object in a manner that he could not previously have remembered. One can only remember what has been consciously experienced. But the emotional world of a child with a narcissistic disturbance is itself the result of a selection, which has eliminated the most important elements. These early feelings, joined with the pain of not being able to understand what is going on that is part of the earliest period of childhood, are then consciously experienced for the first time during therapy. The true self has been in a state of non-communication, as Winnicott said, because it had to be protected. The patient never needs to hide anything else so thoroughly, so deeply, and for so long a time as he has hidden his true self. Thus, it is like a miracle each time to see how much individuality has survived behind such dissimulation, denial, and self-alienation, and can reappear as soon as the work of mourning brings freedom from the introjects. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to understand Winnicott's words to mean that there is a fully developed true self hidden behind the false self. If that were so, there would be no narcissistic disturbance, but a conscious self-protection. The important point is that the child does not know what he is hiding. A patient expressed this in the following way. "I lived in a glass house into which my mother could look at any time. In a glass house, however, you cannot conceal anything without giving yourself away, except by hiding it under the ground. And then you cannot see it yourself either." An adult can only be fully aware of his feelings if he has internalized an affectionate and empathetic self-object. People with narcissistic disturbances are missing out on this. Therefore, they are never overtaken by unexpected emotions and will only admit those feelings that are accepted and approved by their inner censor, which is their parents' heir. Depression and a sense of inner emptiness is the price they must pay for this control. To return to Winnicott's concept, the true self cannot communicate because it has remained unconscious and therefore undeveloped in its inner prison. The company of prison warders does not encourage lively development. It is only after it is liberated that the self begins to be articulate, to grow, and to develop its creativity. Where there had only been fearful emptiness or equally frightening grandiose fantasies, there now is unfolding an unexpected wealth of vitality. This is not a homecoming, since this home had never before existed. It is the discovery of home. Third, The phase of separation begins when the patient has reliably acquired the ability to mourn and can face feelings from his childhood without the constant need for the therapist. It is often said that psychotherapists suffer from a narcissistic disturbance. The purpose of my presentation so far has been to clarify the extent to which this can be confirmed, not only inductively based on experience, but also deductively from the type of talent that is needed by a therapist. His sensibility, his empathy, his intense and differentiated emotional responsiveness, and his unusually powerful antennae seem to predestine him as a child to be used, if not misused, by people with intense narcissistic needs. Of course, there is the theoretical possibility that a child who was gifted in this way could have had parents who did not need to abuse him, parents who saw him as he really was, understood him, and tolerated and respected his feelings. Such a child would develop a healthy narcissism. One could hardly expect, however, 1, that he would later take up the profession of psychotherapist, 2, that he would cultivate and develop his sensorium for others to the same extent as those who were narcissistically used, 3, that he would ever be able to understand sufficiently, on the basis of experience, what it means to have killed oneself. I believe, then, that it is no less our fate than our talent that enables us to exercise the profession of psychotherapist after being given the chance through our training to live with the reality of our past and to give up the most flagrant of our illusions. This means tolerating the knowledge that to avoid losing the object love, the love of the first object, we were compelled to gratify our parents' unconscious needs at the cost of our own self-realization. It also means being able to experience the rebellion and mourning aroused by the fact that our parents were not available to fulfill our primary needs. If we have never lived through this despair and the resulting rage, and have therefore never been able to work through it, we can be in danger of transferring this situation, which then would have remained unconscious, onto our patients. It would not be surprising if our unconscious anger should find no better way than once more to make use of a weaker person and to make him take the unavailable parent's place. This can be done most easily with one's own children or with patients, who at times are as dependent on their analysts as children are on their parents. An analytically talented patient, one with antennae for his therapist's unconscious, reacts promptly. He will quickly feel himself autonomous, and he will react accordingly if he senses that it is important to his therapist to have patients who soon become autonomous and behave with self-confidence. He can do that. He can do anything that is expected of him. But as this autonomy is not genuine, it soon ends in depression. True autonomy is preceded by the emotional experience of being dependent, first on partners, then on the therapist, and finally on the primary objects. True liberation can only be found beyond the deep ambivalence of infantile dependence. The patient satisfies his therapist's narcissistic wish for approval, echo, understanding, and for being taken seriously when he presents material that fits his therapist's knowledge, concepts, and skills, and therefore also his expectations. In this way, the therapist exercises the same sort of unconscious manipulation as that to which he was exposed as a child. He has, of course, long since seen through conscious manipulation and freed himself from it. He has also learned to say no and to stand up for his own opinions and carry them through. But a child can never see through unconscious manipulation. It is like the air he breathes. He knows no other, and it appears to him to be the only normal possibility. One patient, for example, could never be sad nor cry as a child without being aware that he was making his beloved mother unhappy and very unsure of herself, for cheerfulness was the trait that had saved her life in her own childhood. Her children's tears threatened her equilibrium. The extremely sensitive child felt within himself a whole abyss warded off by his mother, who had been in a concentration camp as a child but had never spoken about it. Not until her son was grown up and could ask her questions did she tell him that she was one of 80 children who had to watch their parents going into the gas chambers, and not one child had cried. Throughout his childhood, this son had tried to be cheerful and could express his true self, his feelings and inklings, only in obsessive perversions, which seemed alien, shameful, and incomprehensible to him until he came into therapy. The shaming nature of perversions and obsessional behavior can often be understood as the introjection of the parent's shocked reaction to their child's natural, instinctual behavior. Normal sexual fulfillment no longer evokes horror in the introjected mother as it formerly did in the real one, but perverted behavior is sure to do so. One is totally defenseless against this sort of manipulation in childhood. The tragedy is that the parents, too, do not know what is happening, and even if they have some inkling, they can do nothing to change it, unless they get help. Their conscious aims are genuinely quite different, even giving every possible support. But unconsciously, the parents' childhood tragedy is continued in their children. Another example may illustrate this more clearly. A father, who as a child had often been frightened by the anxiety attacks of his periodically schizophrenic mother without ever receiving an explanation, enjoyed telling his beloved small daughter gruesome stories. He laughed at her fears and afterward always comforted her with the words, "But it's only a made-up story. You don't need to be scared. You are here with me." In this way, he could manipulate his child's fear and have the feeling of being strong. His conscious wish was to give the child something valuable that he himself had been deprived of, namely protection, comfort, and explanations. But what he unconsciously handed on was his own childhood fear, the expectation of disaster, and the unanswered question, also from his childhood, why does the person whom I love and who loves me frighten me so much? Probably everybody has a more or less concealed inner chamber that he hides even from himself, and in which the props of his childhood drama are to be found. These props may be his secret delusion, a secret perversion, or quite simply the unmastered aspects of his childhood suffering. The only ones who will certainly gain entrance to this hidden chamber are his children. With them, new life comes into it, and the drama is continued. All the same, when he was a child, he hardly had a chance to play freely with these props. His role merged into his life. And so he could not take any memories of such playing with him for later, except through unconscious repetition in therapy when he might begin to ask questions about his role. The props may well have frightened him at times. Understandably, he could not connect them with the familiar figures of father or mother, for after all, they represented the split-off, unintegrated part of the parents. But the child cannot experience this contradiction consciously. He simply accepts everything, and at the most, develops symptoms. Then in therapy, the feelings emerge. Feelings of terror, of despair and rebellion, of mistrust, but if it is possible to reconstruct the parents' vicissitudes, also of compassion and reconciliation. Can it be an accident that Heinrich Pestalozzi, who was fatherless from his 6th year onward and emotionally neglected despite the presence of his mother and of a nurse, had the idea of bringing up his only son according to Rousseau's methods, although he was capable, on the other hand, of giving orphan children genuine warmth and fatherliness. This son finally grew up neglected, as a 10-year-old was considered to be mentally defective, caused Pestalozzi much pain and guilt feelings, and then died at the age of 30. In H. Gant's 1966 we can read, Jacob Lee is to have a garden of his own to look after, set plants in, collecting chrysalis and beetles in an orderly, exact, and industrious manner. What a bridal for indolence and wildness. Jacob Lee is now 3.5 years old. It would be about a year later, on the occasion of his father's name day, that Jacob Lee, who could not write, half singing, half murmuring, gaily dictated to his mother, I wish, my dear Papa, that you should see a lot more, and I thank you 100,000 times for your goodness, that you have brought me up so joyfully and lovingly. Now I shall speak from my heart. It makes me terribly happy if you can say I have brought my son up to happiness. I am his joy and his happiness. Then shall I first give thanks for what you have done in my life. It was also Pestalozzi who is reputed to have said, you can drive the devil out of your garden, but you will find him again in the garden of your son. One could say that it is the split-off and unintegrated parts of his parents that have been introjected by the child. The more insight one gains into the unintentional and unconscious manipulation of children by their parents, the fewer illusions one has about the possibility of changing the world without acknowledging these mechanisms. It seems to me that if we can do anything, it is to work through our own problems and reintegrate our split-off aspects to such an extent that we no longer have any need to manipulate our patients according to our theories, but can allow them to become what they really are. Only after painfully experiencing and accepting our own truth can we be relatively free from the hope that we might still find an understanding, empathetic mother, perhaps in a patient, or in our child, who would then be at our disposal. This temptation should not be underestimated. Our own mothers seldom or never listened to us with such rapt attention as our patients usually do, and she never revealed her inner world to us so clearly and honestly as our patients do at times. However, the work of mourning can help us not to lapse into this illusion. A mother such as we once urgently needed, empathetic and open, understanding and understandable, available and usable, transparent, clear, without unintelligible contradictions, such a mother was never ours. Indeed, she could hardly exist, for every mother carries with her a bit of her unmastered past, which she unconsciously hands on to her child. Each mother can only react empathetically to the extent that she has become conscious of her own childhood, and she is forced to react without empathy to the extent that by denying the vicissitudes of her early life, she wears invisible chains. But what does exist are children like this. Intelligent, alert, attentive, extremely sensitive, and because they are completely attuned to her well-being, entirely at the mother's disposal and ready for her use. Above all, they are transparent, clear, reliable, and easy to manipulate, as long as their true self, their emotional world, remains in the cellar of the transparent house in which they have to live, sometimes until puberty or until they come to therapy, and very often until they have become parents themselves. In Alphonse Daudet's Lettres de mon Moulin, I have found a story that may sound rather bizarre, but nevertheless has much in common with what I have presented here. I shall summarize the story briefly. Once upon a time there was a child who had a golden brain. His parents only discovered this by chance when he injured his head and gold instead of blood flowed out. They then began to look after him carefully and would not let him play with other children for fear of being robbed. When the boy was grown up and wanted to go out into the world, his mother said, "We have done so much for you. We ought to be able to share your wealth." Then her son took a large piece of gold out of his brain and gave it to his mother. He lived in great style with a friend who, however, robbed him one night and ran away. After that, the man resolved to guard his secret and to go out to work because his reserves were visibly dwindling. One day he fell in love with a beautiful girl who loved him too, but no more than the beautiful clothes he gave her so lavishly. He married her and was very happy, but after 2 years she died, and he spent the rest of his wealth on her funeral, which had to be splendid. Once, as he was creeping through the streets, weak, poor, and unhappy, he saw a beautiful little pair of boots that would have just done for his wife. He forgot that she was dead, perhaps because his emptied brain no longer worked, and entered the shop to buy the boots. But in that very moment he fell, and the shopkeeper saw a dead man lying on the ground. Daudet, who was to die from an illness of the spinal cord, wrote below the end of this story. This story sounds as though it were invented, but it is true from beginning to end. There are people who have to pay for the smallest things in life with their very substance and their spinal cord. That is a constantly recurring pain, and then, when they are tired of suffering. Does not mother love belong to the smallest but also indispensable things in life, for which many people, paradoxically, have to pay by giving up their living selves? Chapter 2. Depression and Grandiosity as Related Forms of Narcissistic Disturbance. Over the years, my analytic work has included many initial consultations with people seeking advice in looking for an analyst, whom I saw for 1 or 2 sessions. In these short encounters, the tragedy of an individual destiny can often be seen with moving clarity and intensity. What is described as depression and experienced as emptiness, futility, fear of impoverishment, and loneliness can often be recognized as the tragedy of the loss of the self, or alienation from the self, from which many suffer in our generation and society. Through the years of reconstructive work with my patients, I think I have come closer to the childhood origins of this alienation from the self. We cathect an object narcissistically when we experience it not as the center of its own activity, but as a part of ourselves. If the object does not behave as we expect or wish, we may at times be immeasurably disappointed or offended, almost as if an arm ceased to obey us, or a function that we take for granted, such as memory, lets us down. This sudden loss of control may also lead to an intense rage. This sort of attitude is met far more frequently in adults than one might imagine, however much we like to regard it as pathological, unrealistic, or egocentric. Yet in the earliest stage of our life, this is the only attitude possible. Every child has a legitimate need to be noticed, understood, taken seriously, and respected by his mother. In the first weeks and months of life, he needs to have the mother at his disposal, must be able to use her and to be mirrored by her. This is beautifully illustrated in one of Winnicott's images. The mother gazes at the baby in her arms, and the baby gazes at his mother's face and finds himself therein. Provided that the mother is really looking at the unique, small, helpless being, and not projecting her own introjects onto the child, nor her own expectations, fears, and plans for the child. In that case, the child would not find himself in his mother's face, but rather the mother's own predicaments. This child would remain without a mirror, and for the rest of his life would be seeking this mirror in vain. If a child is lucky enough to grow up with a mirroring mother, who is at the child's disposal, that is, a mother who allows herself to be made use of as a function of the child's development, then a healthy self-feeling can gradually develop in the growing child. Ideally, this mother should also provide the necessary emotional climate and understanding for the child's needs. But even a mother who is not especially warm-hearted can make this development possible if she only refrains from preventing it. This enables the child to acquire from other people what the mother lacks. Various investigations have shown the incredible ability that a healthy child displays in making use of the smallest effective nourishment, stimulation, to be found in his surroundings. I understand a healthy self-feeling to mean the unquestioned certainty that the feelings and wishes one experiences are a part of oneself. This certainly is not something one can gain upon reflection. It is there like one's own pulse, which one does not notice as long as it functions normally. This automatic, natural contact with his own feelings and needs gives an individual strength and self-esteem. He may live out his feelings, be sad, despairing, or in need of help, without fear of making the introjected mother insecure. He can allow himself to be afraid when he is threatened or angry when his wishes are not fulfilled. He knows not only what he does not want, but also what he wants, and is able to express this, irrespective of whether he will be loved or hated for it. I will now enumerate some characteristics of successful development, but would like to make it clear that here, as also later on, I am describing constructions of phenomena that are only approximated in reality. Instead of healthy narcissism, it would also be possible to speak of inner freedom and vitality. Aggressive responses to injuries could be expressed because they did not upset the confidence and self-esteem of the parents. Strivings toward autonomy were not experienced as an attack. The child was allowed to experience and express ordinary impulses, such as jealousy, rage, defiance, because his parents did not require him to be special, for instance, to represent their own ethical attitudes. There was no need to please anybody under optimal conditions, and the child could develop and exhibit whatever was active in him during each developmental phase. He could use his parents because they were independent of him. Love was made possible because the parents also loved the child as a separate person. Provided there were phase-appropriate and non-traumatic frustrations, the child was able to integrate his needs and did not have to resort to repression or splitting. What happens if the mother not only is unable to take over the narcissistic functions for the child, but also, as very often happens, is herself in need of narcissistic supplies? Quite unconsciously, and despite her own good intentions, the mother then tries to assuage her own needs through her child. This does not rule out strong affection. On the contrary, the mother often loves her child as her self-object passionately, but not in the way that he needs to be loved. Therefore, the continuity and constancy that would be so important for the child are missing, among other things, from this love. Yet what is missing above all is the framework within which the child could experience his feelings and his emotions. Instead, he develops something the mother needs, and this certainly saves his life, the mother's or the father's love, at the time, but it nevertheless may prevent him throughout his life from being himself. In such cases, the natural needs appropriate to the child's age that are here described cannot be integrated into the developing personality. They are split off, partially repressed, and retain their early archaic form, which makes their later integration still more difficult. With two exceptions, the mothers of all my patients were extremely insecure and often suffered from depression. What these mothers had once failed to find in their own mothers, they were able to find in their children. Someone at their disposal who can be used as an echo, who can be controlled, is completely centered on them, will never desert them, and offers full attention and admiration. If the child's demands became too great, as once did those of her own mother, she is no longer so defenseless and will not allow herself to be tyrannized. She can bring the child up in such a way that he neither cries nor disturbs her. At last, she can make sure that she receives consideration and respect. Let me illustrate this with an example. A patient who was the mother of 4 children had only scanty memories of her own mother. At the beginning of the treatment, she described her as an affectionate, warm-hearted woman who spoke to her openly about her own troubles at an early age, who was very concerned for her own children and sacrificed herself for her family. She must have had the ability to empathize with other people, for she was often asked for advice by others within the sect to which the family belonged. The patient reported that her mother had always been especially proud of her. The mother was now old and an invalid, and the patient was very concerned about her health. She often dreamed that something happened to her mother and woke up with great anxiety. During the course of the therapy, and as a consequence of the emotions that arose in the transference, this picture of her mother changed. Above all, when the period of toilet training entered, she experienced her mother in me as domineering, demanding, controlling, manipulative, bad, cold, stupid, petty, obsessional, touchy, easily offended, overwrought, false, and hard to please. Even if this picture contained the projection of her long dammed-up anger, many childhood memories of her mother did, in fact, include these characteristics. It was only in the course of the therapy, during which she reenacted a great deal from her childhood, that this patient could discover what her mother was really like, through observing her own relationship to her children. Toward the end, she felt that when her mother had felt insecure in relation to her, she had in fact often been cold and treated her badly. Her mother's anxious concern for the child had been a reaction formation to ward off her aggression and envy. Since the mother had often been humiliated as a child, she needed to be valued by her daughter. Gradually, the two pictures of the loving mother and of the wicked witch were united into that of a single human being whose weakness, insecurity, and oversensitivity made it necessary for her to have her child at her disposal. The mother, who apparently functioned well, was herself basically still a child in her relationship to her own child. The daughter, on the other hand, took over the understanding and caring role until she discovered, with her own children, the demanding child within herself, who seemed compelled to press others into her service. Not all children of emotionally deprived mothers have to suffer from such a disturbance. The siblings can usually obtain a certain freedom when one child has already accepted this role. Children who have a nurse or another stranger caring for them from the beginning are usually freer to develop in their own way because they are less often the object of narcissistic cathexis. In his novel Le Lit dans le Valais, Honoré de Balzac described his childhood. His mother preferred his brother, gave Honoré first into the care of a nurse, and then sent him away to school. He suffered greatly, and all his life courted his mother in the guise of different women. But perhaps he was fortunate that this mother did not use him as a glorification of herself. The very hopelessness of his wooing gave him the possibility of developing his own emotional wealth and the ability to freely develop his exceptional capacity for suffering. Perhaps the same is true of Vincent van Gogh, whose mother throughout her life mourned and idealized the first Vincent, who had died very young. The emotionally exploited child has the chance to develop his intellectual capacities undisturbed, but not the world of his emotions, and this will have far-reaching consequences for his well-being. Now his intellect will assume a supportive function of enormous value in strengthening his defense mechanism, but hidden behind that, his narcissistic disturbance may grow deeper. We may in fact find various mixtures and nuances of narcissistic disturbances. For the sake of clarity, I shall try to describe two extreme forms, of which I consider one to be the reverse of the other, grandiosity and depression. Behind manifest grandiosity there constantly lurks depression, and behind a depressive mood there often hide unconscious, or conscious but split off, fantasies of grandiosity. In fact, grandiosity is the defense against depression, and depression is the defense against the deep pain over the loss of the self. Grandiosity. The person who is grandiose is admired everywhere and needs this admiration. Indeed, he cannot live without it. He must excel brilliantly in everything he undertakes, which he surely is capable of doing, otherwise he just does not attempt it. He too admires himself for his qualities, his beauty, cleverness, talents, and for his success and achievements. Woe betide if one of these fails him, for then the catastrophe of a severe depression is imminent. It is usually considered normal that sick or aged people who have suffered the loss of much of their health and vitality, or, for example, women at the time of the menopause, should become depressive. There are, however, other personalities who can tolerate the loss of beauty, health, youth, or loved ones, and although they mourn them, they do so without depression. In contrast, there are those with great gifts, often precisely the most gifted, who suffer from severe depression. One is free from depression when self-esteem is based on the authenticity of one's own feelings and not on the possession of certain qualities. The collapse of self-esteem in a grandiose person will show clearly how precariously that self-esteem had been hanging in the air, hanging from a balloon, a female patient once dreamed. That balloon flew up very high in a good wind, but then suddenly got a hole and soon lay like a little rag upon the ground. For nothing genuine that could have given strength and support later on had ever been developed. The grandiose person's partners, including sexual partners, are also narcissistically cathected. Others are there to admire him, and he himself is constantly occupied, body and soul, with gaining that admiration. This is how his torturing dependence shows itself. The childhood trauma is repeated. He is always the child whom his mother admires, but at the same time, he senses that so long as it is his qualities that are being admired, he is not loved for the person he really is at any given time. In the parents' feelings, dangerously close to pride in their child, shame is concealed, lest he should fail to fulfill their expectations. In a field study conducted at Chestnut Lodge, Maryland in 1954, the family backgrounds of 12 patients suffering from manic depressive psychoses were examined. The results strongly confirm the conclusions I have reached, by other means, about the etiology of depression, and I believe of narcissistic disturbances as a whole. All the patients came from families who were socially isolated and felt themselves to be too little respected in their neighborhood. Therefore, they made special efforts to increase their prestige with their neighbors through conformity and outstanding achievements. The child who later became ill had been assigned a special role in this effort. He was supposed to guarantee the family honor, and was loved only in proportion to the degree to which he was able to fulfill the demands of this family ideal by means of his special abilities, talents, his beauty, etc. If he failed, he was punished by being cold-shouldered or thrown out of the family group, and by the knowledge that he had brought great shame upon his people. I have found a similar social isolation in the families of my patients, but saw this as the result rather than the cause of the parents' narcissistic disturbance. It is thus impossible for the grandiose person to cut the tragic link between admiration and love. In his compulsion to repeat, he seeks insatiably for admiration, of which he never gets enough, because admiration is not the same thing as love. It is only a substitute gratification of the primary needs for respect, understanding, and being taken seriously, needs that have remained unconscious. A patient once spoke of the feeling of always having to walk on stilts. Is somebody who always has to walk on stilts not bound to be constantly envious of those who can walk on their own legs, even if they seem to be smaller and more ordinary than he is himself? And is he not bound to carry pent-up rage within himself against those who have made him afraid to walk without stilts? Thus, envy of other things can come about as the result of the defense mechanism of displacement. Basically, he is envious of healthy people because they do not have to make a constant effort to earn admiration, and because they do not have to do something in order to impress one way or the other, but are free to be average. The phallic man must be a really splendid fellow if he wants to feel like a man at all. However, as soon as he has to be something specific and is not allowed to be what he really is, he loses, understandably, his sense of self. He then tries all the more to blow up his self-esteem, which again leads to narcissistic weakening, and so on, ad infinitum. Fellini's Casanova portrayed this person and his anguish most impressively. The grandiose person is never really free. First, because he is excessively dependent on admiration from the object, and second, because his self-respect is dependent on qualities, functions, and achievements that can suddenly fail. Depression as the reverse of grandiosity. Among the patients I have known, depression was coupled with grandiosity in many ways. First, depression sometimes appeared when grandiosity broke down as a result of sickness, disablement, or aging. The source of external narcissistic supplies, for example, gradually dried up in the case of an unmarried woman as she grew older. She no longer received from men constant confirmation of her attractiveness, which earlier had a directly supportive function as a substitute for the missing mirroring by her mother. Superficially, her despair about getting old seemed to be due to the absence of sexual contacts, but at a deeper level, early fears of being abandoned, stemming from the symbiotic phase, were now aroused, and this woman had no new conquests with which to counteract them. All her substitute mirrors were broken, and she again stood helpless and confused as the small girl once did before her mother's face, in which she did not find herself, but her mother's confusion. The so-called phallic narcissistic men can experience their aging in a similar way, even if a new love affair may seem to create the illusion of their youth for a time, and in this way may introduce brief manic phases into the early stages of the depression caused by their aging. Second, this combination of alternating phases of grandiosity and depression can be seen in many other people. They are the two sides of the medal that could be described as the false self, a medal that was actually once given for achievements. An actor, for example, at the height of his success, can play before an enthusiastic audience and experience feelings of heavenly greatness and almightiness. Nevertheless, his sense of emptiness and futility, even of shame and anger, can return the next morning if his happiness the previous night was due not only to his creative activity in playing and expressing the part, but also, and above all, was rooted in the substitute satisfaction of old needs for echoing, mirroring, and being seen and understood. If his success the previous night only serves as the denial of childhood frustrations, then, like every substitute, it can only bring momentary satiation. In fact, true satiation is no longer possible, since the right time for that now lies irrevocably in the past. The former child no longer exists, nor do the former parents. The present parents, if they are still alive, are now old and dependent, have no longer any power over their son, are delighted with his success and with his infrequent visits. In the present, the son enjoys success and recognition, but these things cannot offer him more than they are. They cannot fill the old gap. Again, as long as he can deny this with the help of illusion, that is, the intoxication of success, the old wound cannot heal. Depression leads him close to his wounds, but only the mourning for what he has missed at the crucial time, can lead to real healing. Let me cite a remark by Igor Stravinsky as an example of successful mourning. I am convinced that it was my misfortune that my father was spiritually very distant from me, and that even my mother had no love for me. When my oldest brother died unexpectedly, without my mother transferring her feelings from him onto me, and my father also remaining as reserved as ever, I resolved that one day I would show them. Now this day has come and gone. No one remembers this day but me, who am its only remaining witness. This is in marked contrast to the statement by Samuel Beckett. One could say that I had a happy childhood, although I showed little talent for being happy. My parents did all that can be done to make a child happy, but I often felt very lonely. Here the childhood drama has been fully introjected, and idealization of the parents was maintained with the help of denial, yet the boundless isolation of his childhood found expression in Beckett's plays. Third, continuous performance of outstanding achievements may sometimes enable an individual to maintain the illusion of constant attention and availability of his self-object, whose absence in his early childhood he must now deny just as much as his own emotional reactions. Such a person is usually able to ward off threatening depression with increased displays of brilliance, thereby deceiving both himself and those around him. However, he quite often chooses a marriage partner who either already has strong depressive traits, or at least within their marriage, unconsciously takes over and enacts the depressive components of the grandiose partner. This means that the depression is outside. The grandiose one can look after his poor partner, protect him like a child, feel himself to be strong and indispensable, and thus gain another supporting pillar for the building of his own personality, which actually has no secure foundations and is dependent on the supporting pillars of success, achievement, strength, and above all, of denying the emotional world of his childhood. Fourth, finally, depression can be experienced as a constant and overt dejection that appears to be unrelated to grandiosity. However, the repressed or split-off fantasies of grandiosity of the depressive are easily discovered, for example, in his moral masochism. He has especially severe standards that apply only to himself. In other people, he accepts without question thoughts and actions that in himself he would consider mean or bad when measured against his high ego ideal. Others are allowed to be ordinary, but that he can never be. Although the outward picture of depression is quite the opposite of that of grandiosity, and has a quality that expresses the tragedy of the loss of self to a great extent, they have the same roots in the narcissistic disturbance. Both are indications of an inner prison, because the grandiose and the depressive individuals are compelled to fulfill the introjected mother's expectations. Whereas the grandiose person is her successful child, the depressive sees himself as a failure. They have many points in common. A false self that has led to the loss of the potential true self, a fragility of self-esteem that is based on the possibility of realizing the false self because of lack of confidence in one's own feelings and wishes, perfectionism, a very high ego ideal, denial of the rejected feelings, the missing of a shadow in the reflected image of Narcissus, a preponderance of narcissistic cathexes of objects, an enormous fear of loss of love and therefore a great readiness to conform, envy of the healthy, strong aggression that is split off and therefore not neutralized, oversensitivity, a readiness to feel shame and guilt, restlessness. Thus, depression can be understood as a sign of the loss of the self and consists of a denial of one's own emotional reactions and feelings. This denial begins in the service of an absolutely essential adaptation during childhood to avoid losing the object's love. Subsequently, it continues under the influence of the introjects. For this reason, depression indicates a very early disturbance. Right at the beginning, in infancy, such persons have suffered from a deficiency in certain affective areas that are necessary for stable self-confidence. From the reconstructions available through therapies, I have gained the impression that there are children who have not been free to experience the very earliest feelings, such as discontent, anger, rage, pain, even hunger, and of course, enjoyment of their own bodies. Discontent and anger had aroused uncertainty in the mother over her maternal role. Pain had made her anxious. Her children's enjoyment of their bodies sometimes aroused her envy, sometimes her shame about what other people would think, or it disturbed the mother's reaction formations. Thus, under certain circumstances, a child may learn very early what he is not allowed to feel, lest he run the risk of losing his mother's love. A patient in her 4th year of therapy came to a session several weeks after the birth of her 3rd child and told me how free and alive she felt with this baby, quite in contrast to the way she had felt with the 2 earlier ones. With them, she had constantly felt that excessive demands were being made upon her, that she was a prisoner, and that the baby was taking advantage of and exploiting her. Thus she rebelled against his justified demands, and at the same time felt that this was very bad of her. As in depression, she was separated from her true self. She thought these earlier reactions might have been rebellion against her mother's demands, for this time she was experiencing nothing of this sort. The love she had then struggled to feel now came of its own accord. She could enjoy her unity with this child and with herself. Then she spoke of her mother in the following words. I was the jewel in my mother's crown. She often said, "Maya can be relied upon. She will cope." And I did cope. I brought up the smaller children for her so that she could get on with her professional career. She became more and more famous, but I never saw her happy. How often I longed for her in the evenings. The little ones cried, and I comforted them, but I myself never cried. Who would have wanted a crying child? I could only win my mother's love if I was competent, understanding, and controlled, if I never questioned her actions nor showed her how much I missed her. That would have limited her freedom, which she needed so much. It would have turned her against me. At that time, nobody ever would have thought that this quiet, competent, useful Maya could be so lonely and have suffered so much. What could I do but be proud of my mother and help her? The deeper the hole in my mother's heart was, the bigger the jewels in her crown needed to be. My poor mother needed these jewels because, at bottom, all her activities served only to suppress something in herself, perhaps a longing, I don't know. Perhaps she would have discovered it, if she had been fortunate enough to be a mother in a more than biological sense. It is not her fault. She tried so hard, but she had not been given the gift. And how all of this repeated itself with Peter. How many empty hours my child had to spend with the maids so that I could get my diploma, which only took me further away from him and from myself. How often I deserted him without seeing what I was doing to him, because I had never been able to experience my own sense of being deserted. Only now do I begin to realize what motherhood, without crown or jewels or a halo, can be like. A German women's magazine, which tries to speak openly of truths that have been tabooed, published a reader's letter in which the tragic story of her experience of motherhood was told without camouflage. It is the nature of the problem that she could not really experience either her own tragedy or that of her child, since her own emotionally inaccessible childhood was the real beginning of the story. Her report ends with the following passage. And then the breastfeeding. The baby was put to the breast all wrong, and soon my nipples were all bitten. God, how that hurt. Just 2 hours, and then it was back. Another one, the same. While it was sucking there, I was crying and swearing above it. It was so terrible that soon I couldn't eat anymore and had a temperature of 40 degrees Celsius. Then I was allowed to wean and suddenly felt better. It was a long time before I noticed any maternal feelings. I wouldn't have minded if the baby had died, and everybody expected me to be happy. In despair, I telephoned a friend who said that I'd get fond of him in time through being busy with him and having him around all the time. But that did not happen either. I only began to be fond of him when I could go back to work, and only saw him when I came home, as a distraction and toy, so to speak. But quite honestly, a little dog would have done just as well. Now that he is gradually getting bigger, and I see that I can train him, and that he is devoted to me and trusts me, I am beginning to develop tender feelings for him, and am glad that he is there. I have written all this because I think it is a good thing that somebody should, at last, say that there is no such thing as mother love, not to speak of a maternal instinct. The legend of Narcissus actually tells us the tragedy of the narcissistic disturbance. Narcissus sees his reflection in the water and falls in love with his own beautiful face, of which his mother was surely proud. The nymph Echo answers the young man's calls because she is in love with his beauty, just as their mothers are with our patients. Echo's answering calls deceive Narcissus. His reflection deceives him as well, since it shows only his perfect, wonderful side and not his other parts. His back view, for instance, and his shadow remain hidden from him. They do not belong to and are cut off from his beloved reflection. This stage of rapture can be compared with grandiosity, just as the next, the consuming longing for himself, can be likened to depression. Narcissus wanted to be nothing but the beautiful youth. He denied his true self, wanted to be at one with the beautiful picture. This leads to a giving up of himself, to death, or, in Ovid's version, to being changed into a flower. This death is the logical consequence of the fixation on the false self. It is not only the beautiful, good, and pleasant feelings that make us really alive, deepen our existence, and give us crucial insight, but often, precisely, the unacceptable and unadapted ones from which we would prefer to escape: impotence, shame, envy, jealousy, confusion, and mourning. These feelings can be experienced in the therapist's consulting room and grow beyond their archaic form. In this way, this room is also a mirror of the patient's inner world, which is much richer than the beautiful countenance. Narcissus was in love with his idealized picture, but neither the grandiose nor the depressive Narcissus can really love himself. His passion for his false self not only makes object love impossible, but also love for the one person who is fully entrusted to his care, he, himself. A grandiose person will only look for a therapy if depressive episodes come to his aid and force him to do so. As long as the grandiose defense is effective, this form of narcissistic disturbance exerts no pressure through visible suffering, except when other members of the family, spouse or children, have to seek psychotherapeutic help for depression or psychosomatic disorders. In our therapeutic work, we encounter grandiosity that is coupled with depression. On the other hand, we see depression in almost all our patients, either in the form of a manifest illness or in distinctive phases of depressive moods. These phases can have different functions. Signal function. Some therapists may be familiar with sessions when the patient arrives complaining of depression and later leaves the consulting room in tears, but much relieved and free from depression. Perhaps this patient has now been able to experience a long pent-up rage against his mother, or he has been able to express his mistrust of the therapist's superiority, or to feel for the first time his sadness over the many lost years of his life, during which he did not really live. Or he has vented his anger over the impending holidays and separation from his therapist. It is irrelevant which of these feelings are coming to the fore. The important thing is that they could be experienced. The depression had signaled their proximity, but also their denial. The session enabled the feelings to break through, and then the depression disappeared. Such a mood can be an indication that parts of the self that had been rejected, feelings, fantasies, wishes, fears, have become stronger without finding discharge in grandiosity. Denial of self. Some patients, while feeling content and understood after having come close to the core of their selves in a session, will organize a party or something else equally unimportant to them at that moment, which will make them feel lonely and inadequate again. After a few days, they will complain of self-alienation and emptiness, of again having lost the way to themselves. Here, the patient has actively, though unconsciously, provoked a situation that could demonstrate the repetition of what used to happen to him as a child. When he really got a sense of himself in play, feeling creative in Winnicott's sense, he would be asked to do something more sensible, to achieve something, and his world, which was just beginning to unfold, would be overthrown. These patients, even as children, probably reacted to this by withdrawing their feelings and by becoming depressed. The accumulation of strong, hidden feelings. Patients who are no longer depressive sometimes still have depressive phases that may last several weeks before strong emotions from their childhood break through. It is as though the depression had held back the effect. When it can be experienced, insight and associations related to the primary objects follow, often accompanied by significant dreams. The patient feels fully alive again until a new depressive phase signals something new. This may be expressed in the following fashion. I no longer have a feeling of myself. How could it happen that I should lose myself again? I have no connection with what is within me. It is all hopeless. It will never be any better. Everything is pointless. I am longing for my former sense of being alive. An aggressive outbreak may follow, with reproaches against the therapist, and only after this outbreak will a new link become clear and new vitality be felt. The struggle with the introjects. There will also be times of depressive moods, even after the patient has started to resist the demands of his introjects. He may, for example, resist their demands for achievement, although he has not yet fully freed himself from them. Then he lands again in the cul-de-sac of making pointlessly excessive demands upon himself, and he will only become aware of this when a depressive mood rises. This, for instance, may find expression in the following way. The day before yesterday, I was so happy my work went easily. I was able to do more work for the exam than I had planned for the whole week. Then I thought I must take advantage of this good mood and do another chapter in the evening. I worked all evening, but without any enthusiasm, and the next day I couldn't do any more. I felt like such an idiot. Nothing stayed in my head. I didn't want to see anyone either. It felt like the depressions I used to have. Then I turned the pages back and found where it had begun. I had spoiled my pleasure as soon as I made myself do more and more. But why? Then I remembered how my mother used to say, "You have done that beautifully. Now you could surely do this, too." I got angry and left the books alone. Then suddenly, I trusted myself to know when I was ready to work again. And of course, I did, too. But the depression went away sooner, at the point when I realized that I had once again exceeded my limits. Everyone probably knows from his own experience about depressive moods. They may be expressed as well as hidden by psychosomatic suffering. It is easy to notice if we pay attention that they hit a person almost with regularity, whenever he suppresses an impulse or an unwanted emotion. And then, at once, such depressive moods will stifle all spontaneity. If an adult, for example, cannot experience mourning when he loses someone dear to him, but tries to distract himself from his sadness, or if he suppresses and hides from himself his indignation over an idealized friend's behavior out of fear of losing his friendship, he must reckon with the probability of depression, unless his grandiose defense is constantly at his disposal. When he begins to pay attention to these connections, he can benefit from his depression and use it to learn the truth about himself. A child does not yet have this possibility. He cannot yet see through his mechanism of self-deception, and on the other hand, he is far more threatened than an adult by the intensity of his feelings if he does not have a supportive, holding, empathetic environment. It is precisely because a child's feelings are so strong that they cannot be repressed without serious consequences. The stronger a prisoner is, the thicker the prison walls have to be, which impede or completely prevent later emotional growth. Once a person has experienced a few times that the breakthrough of intense early childhood feelings, characterized by the specific quality of non-comprehension, can relieve a long period of depression, this experience will bring about a gradual change in his way of approaching undesired feelings, above all those of pain. He discovers that he is no longer compelled to follow the former pattern of disappointment, suppression of pain, and depression, since he now has another possibility of dealing with disappointment, namely that of experiencing pain. In this way, he at least gains access to his early experiences, to the parts of himself and of his fate that were previously hidden from him. A patient expressed it thus: "It was not the beautiful or pleasant feelings that gave me new insight, but the ones against which I had fought most strongly, feelings that made me experience myself as shabby, petty, mean, helpless, humiliated, demanding, resentful, or confused, and above all, sad and lonely. It was precisely through these experiences, which I had shunned for so long, that I became certain that I now understand something about my life, stemming from the core of my being, something that I could not have learned from any book." This patient was describing the process of creative insight. Interpretations play an important part in this process. They can accompany it, support, hold, and encourage, but they can also disturb, hamper, and delay, or even prevent it or reduce it to mere intellectual insight. A patient with narcissistic problems is all too ready to give up his own pleasure in discovery and self-expression and accommodate himself to his therapist's concepts out of fear of losing the latter's affection, understanding, and empathy for which he has been waiting all his life. Because of his early experiences with his mother, he cannot believe that this need not necessarily be so. If he gives way to this fear and adapts himself, the therapy slides over into the sphere of the false self, and the true self remains hidden and undeveloped. It is therefore extremely important that the therapist does not affect the patient narcissistically. That is, his own needs should not impel him to formulate connections that the patient himself is discovering with the help of his own feelings. Otherwise, he is in danger of behaving like a friend who brings some good food to a prisoner in his cell at the precise moment when the prisoner has the chance to escape, perhaps spending his first night without shelter and hungry, but nevertheless in freedom. Since this step into unknown territory requires a great deal of courage in the first instance, it can happen that the prisoner, comforting himself with his food and shelter, misses his chance and stays in prison. Recognizing the fragility of a creative process obviously does not mean that the therapist must adopt a mostly silent and hurtful attitude, but merely that he must exercise care in this respect. It is possible, for example, that his compulsion to repeat can be of good service to his creative self-discovery, especially if its indirect communications are understood. This will come about through producing a variety of new situations through which an old, unremembered situation can, for the first time, be consciously experienced in its full tragedy and then finally be mourned. It is part of the dialectic of the mourning process that such experiences both encourage and are dependent on self-discovery. Grandiosity is the counterpart of depression within the narcissistic disturbance. The patient can therefore be freed from his depression for a while if the psychotherapist knows how to let the patient share in his own grandeur. That is, when he can enable the patient to feel big and strong as a part of the idealized therapist. The narcissistic disturbance then appears in a different guise for a while, even though it still exists. The achievement of freedom from both forms of narcissistic disturbance is hardly possible without deeply felt mourning. This ability to mourn, that is, to give up the illusion of his happy childhood, can restore the depressive's vitality and creativity, and if he comes to therapy at all, free the grandiose person from the exertions of and dependence on his Sisyphean task. If a person is able, during this long process, to experience that he was never loved as a child for what he was, but for his achievements, success, and good qualities, and that he sacrificed his childhood for this love, this will shake him very deeply, but one day he will feel the desire to end this courtship. He will discover in himself a need to live according to his true self and no longer be forced to earn love, a love that at root still leaves him empty-handed, since it is given to the false self which he has begun to relinquish. The true opposite of depression is not gaiety or absence of pain, but vitality, the freedom to experience spontaneous feelings. It is part of the kaleidoscope of life that these feelings are not only cheerful, beautiful, and good, they also can display the whole scale of human experience, including envy, jealousy, rage, disgust, greed, despair, and mourning. But this freedom cannot be achieved if the childhood roots are cut off. For a person with narcissistic problems, access to the true self is thus only possible when he no longer has to be afraid of the intense, psychotic emotional world of his early childhood. Once he has experienced this, it is no longer strange and threatening, and need no longer be hidden behind the prison walls of illusion. After a long depressive phase, accompanied by suicidal thoughts, a 40-year-old patient was at last able to experience her violent, very early ambivalence in the transference. This was not immediately followed by visible relief, but by a period full of mourning and tears. At the end of this period, she said, "The world has not changed. There is so much evil and meanness all around me, and I see it even more clearly than before. Nevertheless, for the first time I find life really worth living. Perhaps this is because for the first time I have the feeling that I am really living my own life. And that is an exciting adventure. On the other hand, I can understand my suicidal ideas better now, especially those I had in my youth. It seemed pointless to carry on, because in a way I had always been living a life that wasn't mine, that I didn't want, and that I was ready to throw away." Chapter 3. The Vicious Cycle of Contempt. Would not God find a way out? Some superior deception, such as the grown-ups and the powerful always contrived, producing one more trump card at the last moment, shaming me after all, not taking me seriously, humiliating me under the damnable mask of kindness? Hermann Hesse, A Child's Heart. While away on vacation, I was sorting out my thoughts on the subject of contempt and reading various notes on this theme that I had made about individual therapeutic sessions. Probably sensitized by this preoccupation, I was more than usually affected by an ordinary scene in no way spectacular or rare. I shall describe it to introduce my observations, for it illustrates some of the insights I have gained in the course of my work without any danger of indiscretion. I was out for a walk and noticed a young couple a few steps ahead, both tall. They had a little boy with them, about 2 years old, who was running alongside and whining. We are accustomed to seeing such situations from the adult point of view, but here I want to describe it as it was experienced by the child. The two had just bought themselves ice cream bars on sticks from the kiosk and were licking them with enjoyment. The little boy wanted one too. His mother said affectionately, "Look, you can have a bite of mine. A whole one is too cold for you." The child did not want just one bite, but held out his hand for the whole ice, which his mother took out of his reach again. He cried in despair, and soon exactly the same thing was repeated with his father. "There you are, my pet," said the father affectionately. "You can have a bite of mine." "No, no," cried the child, and ran ahead again, trying to distract himself. Soon he came back again and gazed enviously and sadly up at the two grown-ups who were enjoying their ice creams contentedly and at one. Time and again he held out his little hand for the whole ice cream bar, but the adult hand with its treasure was withdrawn again. The more the child cried, the more it amused his parents. It made them laugh a lot, and they hoped to humor him along with their laughter too. "Look, it isn't so important. What a fuss you are making." Once the child sat down on the ground and began to throw little stones over his shoulder in his mother's direction. But then he suddenly got up again and looked around anxiously, making sure that his parents were still there. When his father had completely finished his ice cream, he gave the stick to the child and walked on. The little boy licked the bit of wood expectantly, looked at it, threw it away, wanted to pick it up again but did not do so, and a deep sob of loneliness and disappointment shook his small body. Then he trotted obediently after his parents. It seemed clear to me that this little boy was not being frustrated in his oral drives, for he was given ample opportunity to take a bite. It was his narcissistic needs that were constantly being wounded and frustrated. His wish to hold the ice cream stick in his hand like the others was not understood. Worse still, it was laughed at. They made fun of his needs. He was faced with two giants who were proud of being consistent and also supported each other, while he, quite alone in his distress, obviously could say nothing beyond no, nor could he make himself clear to his parents with his gestures, which were very expressive. He had no advocate. What an unfair situation it is, by the way, when a child is opposed by two big, strong adults as by a wall. We call it consistency in upbringing when we refuse to let the child complain about one parent to the other. Why indeed did these parents behave with so little empathy? Why didn't one of them think of eating a little quicker, or even of throwing away half his ice cream and giving the child his stick with a bit of edible substance? Why did they both stand there laughing, eating so slowly and showing so little concern about the child's obvious distress? They were not unkind or cold parents. The father spoke to his child very tenderly. Nevertheless, at least at this moment, they displayed a lack of empathy. We can only solve this riddle if we manage to see the parents, too, as insecure children. Children who have at last found a weaker creature, and in comparison with him, they can now feel very strong. What child has never been laughed at for his fears and been told, "You don't need to be afraid of a thing like that"? And what child will then not feel shamed and despised because he could not assess the danger correctly? And will that little person not take the next opportunity to pass on these feelings to a still smaller child? Such experiences come in all shades and varieties. Common to them all is the sense of strength that it gives the adult to face the weak and helpless child's fear, and to have the possibility of controlling fear in another person, while he cannot control his own. No doubt in 20 years' time, or perhaps earlier if he has younger siblings, our little boy will replay this scene with the ice cream, but then he will be in possession, and the other one will be the helpless, envious, weak little creature, whom he then no longer has to carry within himself, but now can split off and project outside himself. Contempt for those who are smaller and weaker thus is the best defense against a breakthrough of one's own feelings of helplessness. It is an expression of this split-off weakness. The strong person who knows that he, too, carries this weakness within himself because he has experienced it, does not need to demonstrate his strength through such contempt. Many adults first become aware of their feelings of helplessness, jealousy, and loneliness through their own children, since they had no chance to acknowledge and experience these feelings consciously in their childhood. I spoke of the patient who was obsessively forced to make conquests with women, to seduce and then to abandon them, until he was at last able to experience, in his therapy, how he himself had repeatedly been abandoned by his mother. Now he remembered how he had been caught at night outside the locked door of his parents' bedroom and laughed at. Now in the session is the first time that he consciously experiences the feelings of humiliation and mortification that were then aroused. The suffering that was not consciously felt can be got rid of by delegating it to one's own children, in much the same way as in the ice cream scene I have just described. You see, we are big, we may do as we like, but for you it is too cold. You may only enjoy yourself as we do when you get to be big enough. So it is not the instinctual frustration that is humiliating for the child, but the contempt shown for his wishes. It may well be that the narcissistic frustration is commonly accentuated when the parents demonstrate their grown-upness to revenge themselves unconsciously on their child for their own earlier humiliation. In the child's eyes, they encounter their own humiliating past, and they must ward it off with the power they have now achieved. In many societies, little girls suffer additional discrimination because they are girls. Since women, however, have control of the newborn and the infants, these erstwhile little girls can pass on to their children at the most tender age the contempt from which they once had suffered. Later, the adult man will idealize his mother, since every human being needs the feeling that he was really loved, but he will despise other women, upon whom he thus revenges himself in place of his mother. And these humiliated adult women, in turn, if they have no other means of ridding themselves of their burden, will revenge themselves upon their own children. Indeed, this can be done secretly and without fear of reprisals, for the child has no way of telling anyone, except perhaps in the form of perversion or obsessional neurosis, whose language is sufficiently veiled not to betray the mother. Contempt is the weapon of the weak, and a defense against one's own despised and unwanted feelings. And the fountainhead of all contempt, all discrimination, is the more or less conscious, uncontrolled, and secret exercise of power over the child by the adult, which is tolerated by society, except in the case of murder or serious bodily harm. What adults do to their children's spirit is entirely their own affair, for the child is regarded as the parent's property in the same way as the citizens of a totalitarian state are the property of its government. Until we become sensitized to the small child's suffering, this wielding of power by adults will continue to be a normal aspect of the human condition, for no one pays attention to or takes seriously what is regarded as trivial, since the victims are only children. But in 20 years' time, these children will be adults who will have to pay it all back to their own children. They may then fight vigorously against cruelty in the world, and yet they will carry within themselves an experience of cruelty to which they have no access and which remains hidden behind their idealized picture of a happy childhood. Let us hope that the degree to which this discrimination is persistently transmitted from one generation to the next might be reduced by education and increasing awareness, especially in its more subtle manifestations. Someone who slaps or hits another or knowingly insults him is aware of hurting him. He has some sense of what he's doing. But how often were our parents and we ourselves toward our own children unconscious of how painfully, deeply, and lastingly we injured a child's tender, budding self? It is very fortunate when our children are aware of this situation and are able to tell us about it, for this may enable them to throw off the chains of power, discrimination, and scorn that have been handed on for generations. When our children can consciously experience their early helplessness and narcissistic rage, they will no longer need to ward off their helplessness, in turn, with exercise of power over others. In most cases, however, one's own childhood suffering remains effectively inaccessible and thus forms the hidden source of new and sometimes very subtle humiliation for the next generation. Various defense mechanisms will help to justify this. Denial of one's own suffering, rationalization, I owe it to my child to bring him up properly, displacement, it is not my father but my son who is hurting me, idealization, my father's beatings were good for me, and more. And above all, there is the mechanism of turning passive suffering into active behavior. The following examples may illustrate how astonishingly similar the ways are in which people protect themselves against their childhood experiences, despite great differences in personality structure and in education. A 30-year-old Greek, the son of a peasant and owner of a small restaurant in Western Europe, proudly described how he drinks no alcohol and has his father to thank for this abstinence. Once at the age of 15, he came home drunk and was so severely beaten by his father that he could not move for a week. From that time on, he was so averse to alcohol that he could not taste so much as a drop, although his work brought him into constant contact with it. When I heard that he was soon to be married, I asked whether he, too, would beat his children. Of course, he answered. Beatings are necessary in bringing up a child properly. They are the best way to make him respect you. I would never smoke in my father's presence, for example, and that is a sign of my respect for him. This man was neither stupid nor uncongenial, but he had had little schooling. We might therefore nurse the illusion that education could counteract this process of destroying the spirit. But how does this illusion stand up to the next example, which concerns an educated man? A talented Czech author is reading from his own works in a town in Western Germany. After the reading, there follows a discussion with the audience, during which he is asked questions about his life, which he answers ingenuously. He reports that despite his former support of the Prague Spring, he now has plenty of freedom and can frequently travel in the West. He goes on to describe his country's development in recent years. When he is asked about his childhood, his eyes shine with enthusiasm as he talks about his gifted and many-sided father, who encouraged his spiritual development and was a true friend. It is only to his father that he could show his first stories. His father was very proud of him, and even when he beat him as punishment for some misdemeanor reported by the mother, he was proud that his son did not cry. Since tears brought extra blows, the child learned to suppress them and was himself proud that he could make his admired father such a great present with his bravery. This man spoke of these regular beatings as though they were the most normal things in the world, as for him, of course, they were. And then he said, "It did me no harm. It prepared me for life, made me hard, taught me to grit my teeth, and that's why I could get on so well in my profession." Contrasting with this Czech author, the film director Ingmar Bergman spoke on a television program with great awareness and far more understanding of the implications of his own childhood, which he described as one long story of humiliation. He related, for example, that if he wet his trousers, he had to wear a red dress all day so that everybody would know what he had done, and he would have to be ashamed of himself. Ingmar Bergman was the younger son of a Protestant pastor. In this television interview, he described a scene that often occurred during his childhood. His older brother has just been beaten by the father. Now their mother is dabbing his brother's bleeding back with cotton wool. He himself sits watching. Bergman described this scene without apparent agitation, almost coldly. One can see him as a child, quietly sitting and watching. He surely did not run away, nor close his eyes, nor cry. One has the impression that this scene did not take place in reality, but at the same time is a covering memory for what he himself went through. It is unlikely that only his brother was beaten by their father. Some survivors of abuse are convinced that only their siblings suffered humiliation. Only after years of therapy can they remember, with feelings of rage and helplessness, of anger and indignation, how humiliated and deserted they felt when they were beaten by their beloved father. Ingmar Bergman, however, had other possibilities, apart from projection and denial, for dealing with his suffering. He could make films. It is conceivable that we, as the movie audience, have to endure those feelings that he, the son of such a father, could not experience overtly, but nevertheless carried within himself. We sit before the screen, confronted, the way that small boy once was, with all the cruelty our brother has to endure, and hardly feel able or willing to take in all this brutality with authentic feelings. We ward them off. When Bergman speaks regretfully of his failure to see through Nazism before 1945, although as an adolescent he often visited Germany during the Hitler period, we may see it as a consequence of his childhood. Cruelty was the familiar air that he had breathed from early on, and so, why should cruelty have caught his attention? I chose these examples to show how even the most severe ill treatment can remain hidden because of the child's strong tendency to idealization. There is no trial, no advocate, no verdict. Everything remains hidden in the darkness of the past, and should the facts become known, then they appear in the name of blessings. If this is so with the crassest examples of physical ill treatment, then how is emotional torment ever to be exposed when it is less visible and more easily disputed anyway? Who is likely to take serious notice of subtle discrimination, as in the example of the small boy and the ice cream? What does it mean to the child when his sexually inhibited parents make narcissistic use of him in their loneliness and need? Every child seeks loving contact and is happy to get it. At the same time, however, he feels insecure when desires are aroused that do not appear spontaneously at this stage in his development. This insecurity is further increased by the fact that his own autoerotic activity is punished by the parents' prohibitions or scorn. There are other ways of seducing the child, apart from the sexual, for instance with the aid of indoctrination, which underlies both the anti-authoritarian and the strict upbringing. Neither form of rearing takes account of the child's needs at his particular stage of development. As soon as the child is regarded as a possession for which one has a particular goal, as soon as one exerts control over him, his vital growth will be violently interrupted. It is among the commonplaces of education that we often first cut off the living root and then try to replace its natural functions by artificial means. Thus we suppress the child's curiosity, for example. There are questions one should not ask. And then when he lacks a natural interest in learning, he is offered special coaching for his scholastic difficulties. We find a similar example in the behavior of addicts, in whom the object relationship has already been internalized. People who as children successfully repressed their intense feelings often try to regain, at least for a short time, their lost intensity of experience with the help of drugs or alcohol. If we want to avoid the unconscious seduction and discrimination against the child, we must first gain a conscious awareness of these dangers. Only if we become sensitive to the fine and subtle ways in which a child may suffer humiliation can we hope to develop the respect for him that a child needs from the very first day of his life onward if he is to develop emotionally. There are various ways to reach this sensitivity. We may, for instance, observe children who are strangers to us and attempt to feel empathy for them in their situation, or we might try to develop empathy for our own fate. For us, as therapists, there is also the possibility of following our patient into his past, if we accept that his feelings will tell us a true story that so far no one else knows. If we want to do more than provide patients with intellectual insight, then we shall have to embark on a new voyage of discovery with each patient. What we so discover will not be a distant land, but one that does not yet exist, and will only begin to do so in the course of its discovery and settlement. It is a fascinating experience to accompany a patient on this journey, so long as we do not try to enter this new land with concepts that are familiar to us, perhaps in order to avoid our own fear of what is unknown and not yet understood. The patient discovers his true self little by little through experiencing his own feelings and needs, because the therapist is able to accept and respect these even when he does not yet understand them. Can one portray a story that one does not know? This sounds impossible, but it usually happens in therapy. The patient needs a framework for the development of his transference before he can stage his story and make it understood. He needs somebody who does not need him to behave in a particular manner, but can let him be as he is at the moment, and who at the same time is willing to accept any of the roles with which he may be charged for as long as the healing process requires. The compulsion to repeat plays a prominent role in a therapy conceived in this way. Much has been written about the negative aspect of the compulsion to repeat. The uncanny tendency to reenact a trauma, which itself is not remembered, at times has something cruel and self-destructive about it, and understandably suggests associations with the death instinct. Nevertheless, the need to repeat also has a positive side. Repetition is the language used by a child who has remained dumb, his only means of expressing himself. A dumb child needs a particularly emphatic partner if he is to be understood at all. Speech, on the other hand, is often used less to express genuine feelings and thoughts than to hide, veil, or deny them, and thus to express the false self. And so there often are long periods in our work with our patients during which we are dependent on their compulsion to repeat, for this repetition is then the only manifestation of their true self. It lays the basis for the transference, and also for the whole mise-en-scène of the patient's field of interaction, which in the literature is described as acting out, and is often met with mistrust. Take an example. The patient's wish to have a child, expressed during the first weeks or months of a therapy, and his associations often show the narcissistic background to this wish very clearly. To have a child means to him, I want to have somebody whom I can completely possess and whom I can control. My mother always withdrew from me. Somebody who will stay with me all the time and not only for 4 hours a week. Right now I am nobody, but as a mother or a father I should be somebody, and others would value me more than they do now that I have no children. Or it may mean, I want to give a child everything that I had to do without. He should be free, not have to deny himself, be able to develop freely. I want to give this chance to another human being. This second variation sounds very altruistic. But if that were so, the patient would be able to take his time in fulfilling this wish, and to wait until he would be able to give and to care for toward the end of his therapy. If, however, this wish for a child at the beginning of the therapy cannot be delayed but shows such urgency, then it is rather an expression of the patient's own great need. Various aspects come together. The wish to have a mother who is available. The child as a new chance to achieve the good symbiosis, which the patient still seeks since he has never experienced it. The hope that with this birth the patient may become truly alive, the child as symbol for the patient's true self. Unconscious communication about the patient's own fate as a child with the aid of compulsive repetition, the child as rival sibling and abandoned hope. The sibling's birth had increased the patient's loss of self, and with the birth of his child, the patient would give up, for the time being, his hope of realizing his true self. To interpret this wish to have a child as acting out is not usually successful, since the compulsion to repeat is too strong. The therapist is then experienced as a strict mother, against whom the patient would like to rebel. At present, however, the patient can do so only in this self-destructive way, since he is not yet free from introjects. So the therapist is forced to be a spectator while the patient gives life to a new human being, apparently in order to destroy his own chance, but also thereby to rediscover his formerly only half-experienced life, and to experience it consciously now with his newly awakened feelings. Just as a child uses the Sino test figures to represent his family, so the patient unconsciously uses his newborn child to lay out for himself the tragedy of his own fate. The newly won capacity to accept his feelings frees the way for the patient's long repressed needs and wishes, which nevertheless cannot yet be satisfied without self-punishment, or even cannot in reality be satisfied at all, since they are related to past situations. The latter is clearly seen in the example of the urgent and not to be postponed wish for a child, which, as I have tried to describe, expresses among other things the wish to have a mother constantly available. All the same, there are needs that can and should be satisfied in the present and that regularly come up in therapies. Among these is every human being's central need to express himself, to show himself to the world as he really is, in word, in gesture, in behavior, in every genuine utterance from the baby's cry to the artist's creation. For those people who, as children, had to hide their true selves from themselves and others, this first step into the open produces much anxiety. Yet these people especially feel a great need to throw over their former restraints within the protection of their therapy. These first steps do not lead to freedom, but to a compulsive repetition of the patient's childhood constellation, and so he will experience those feelings of agonizing shame and painful nakedness that accompany self-display. With the infallibility of a sleepwalker, the survivor of abuse seeks out those who, like his parents, though for different reasons, certainly cannot understand him. Through his compulsive need to repeat, he will try to make himself understandable to precisely these people, trying to make possible what cannot be. At a particular stage in her therapy, a young woman fell in love with an older, intelligent, and sensitive man who nevertheless, apart from eroticism, had to ward off and reject everything he could not understand intellectually, including psychotherapy. Precisely this person was the one to whom she wrote long letters trying to explain the path she had taken up to this point. She succeeded in overlooking all his signals of incomprehension and increased her efforts even more, until at last she was forced to recognize that she had again found a father substitute, and that this was the reason why she had been unable to give up her hopes of at last being understood. This awakening brought her agonizingly sharp feelings of shame that lasted for a long time. One day she was able to express this during a session and said, "I feel so ridiculous, as if I had been talking to a wall and expecting it to answer like a silly child." I asked, "Would you think it ridiculous if you saw a child who had to tell his troubles to a wall because there was no one else available?" The despairing sobbing that followed my question gave the patient access to a part of her former reality that was pervaded by boundless loneliness. It freed her at the same time from her agonizing and compulsively repeated feelings of shame. The following day, this patient brought her first poem, which she had written that night. Only much later could she risk repeating this experience with a wall, with me, and not only with subsidiary transference figures. For a time, this woman, who was normally capable of expressing herself so clearly, described everything in such an extraordinarily complicated and precipitate way that I had no chance of understanding at all, probably much like her parents earlier. She went through moments of sudden hate and rage, reproaching me with indifference and lack of understanding. My patient now could hardly recognize me anymore, although I had not changed. In this way she rediscovered with me her own childhood. A child, too, can never grasp the fact that the same mother who cooks so well, is so concerned about his cough, and helps so kindly with his homework, in some circumstances has no more feeling than a wall for his hidden inner world. This young woman's vehement reproaches that now were directed against me finally released her from her compulsion to repeat, which had consisted of constantly seeking a partner who had no understanding for her, or of arranging such a constellation so that she would then feel helplessly dependent upon him. The fascination of such tormenting relationships is part of the compulsion constantly to reenact one's earliest disappointments with the parents. If we start from the premise that a person's whole development and his narcissistic balance that is based upon it is dependent on the way his mother experienced his expression of needs and sensations during his first days and weeks of life, then we must assume that here the valuation of feelings and impulses is set. If a mother cannot take pleasure in her child as he is, but must have him behave in a particular way, then the first value selection takes place for the child. Now good is differentiated from bad, nice from nasty, and right from wrong, and this differentiation is introjected by the child. Against this background will follow all his further interjections of the parents' more differentiated valuations. Since every mother has her own room full of props, virtually every infant must learn that there are things about him for which the mother has no use. She will expect her child to control his bodily functions as early as possible. On the conscious level, his parents want him to do this so that he will not offend against society. But unconsciously, they are protecting their own reaction formation, dating from the time when they were themselves small children afraid of offending. Marie Hesse, the mother of the poet and novelist Hermann Hesse, undoubtedly a sensitive woman, describes in her diaries how her own will was broken at the age of 4. When her son was 4 years old, she suffered greatly under his defiant behavior and battled against it with varying degrees of success. At the age of 15, Hermann Hesse was sent to an institution for the care of epileptics and defectives in Stettin to put an end to his defiance once and for all. In an affecting and angry letter from Stettin, Hesse wrote to his parents, "If I were a bigot and not a human being, I could perhaps hope for your understanding." All the same, his release from the home was made conditional upon his improvement, and so the boy improved. In a later poem dedicated to his parents, denial and idealization are restored. He reproaches himself that it had been his character that had made life so difficult for his parents. Many people suffer all their lives from this oppressive feeling of guilt, the sense of not having lived up to their parents' expectations. This feeling is stronger than any intellectual insight that it is not a child's task or duty to satisfy his parents' narcissistic needs. No argument can overcome these guilt feelings, for they have their beginnings in life's earliest period, and from that they derive their intensity and obduracy. That probably greatest of narcissistic wounds, not to have been loved just as one truly was, cannot heal without the work of mourning. It can either be more or less successfully resisted and covered up, as in Grandiosity and Depression, or constantly torn open again in the compulsion to repeat. We encounter this last case in obsessive neurosis and in perversion. The mother's or father's scornful reactions have been introjected. The mother often reacted with surprise and horror, aversion and disgust, shock and indignation, or with fear and panic to the child's most natural impulses. And so these have been the mother's reactions to such natural impulses as the child's autoerotic behavior, investigating and discovering his own body, urination and defecation, touching and playing with his own body, or to his curiosity or rage in response to failure or mistreatment. Later, all these experiences remain closely linked to the mother's horrified eyes, and this clearly emerges in the transference. The patient goes through torment when he reveals to the therapist his hitherto secret sexual and autoerotic behavior. He may, of course, also relate all this quite unemotionally, merely giving information as if he were speaking of some other person. Such a report, however, will not help him to break out of his loneliness, nor lead him back to the reality of his childhood. It is only when he is encouraged not to fend off his feelings of shame and fear, but rather to accept and experience them, that he can discover what he has felt as a child. His most harmless behavior will cause him to feel mean, dirty, or completely annihilated. He himself indeed is surprised when he realizes how long this repressed feeling of shame has survived, and how it has found a place alongside his tolerant and advanced views of sexuality. These experiences first show the patient that his early adaptation by means of splitting was not an expression of cowardice, but that it was really his only chance to escape this sense of impending destruction. What else can one expect of a mother who was always proud of being her mother's dear, good daughter, who was dry at the age of 6 months, clean at a year, at 3 could mother her younger siblings, and so forth? In her own baby, such a mother sees the split-off and never experienced part of herself, of whose breakthrough into consciousness she is afraid, and she sees also the uninhibited sibling baby, whom she mothered at such an early age, and only now envies and perhaps hates in the person of her own child. So she trains her child with looks. As the child grows up, he cannot cease living his own truth and expressing it somewhere, perhaps in complete secrecy. In this way, a person can have adapted completely to the demands of his surroundings and can have developed a false self, but in his perversion or his obsessional neurosis, he still allows a portion of his true self to survive in torment. And so the true self lives on, under the same conditions as the child once did with his disgusted mother, whom in the meantime he has introjected. In his perversion and obsessions, he constantly reenacts the same drama. A horrified mother is necessary before drive satisfaction is possible. Orgasm, for instance, with a fetish, can only be achieved in a climate of self-contempt. Criticism can only be expressed in seemingly absurd, unaccountable, frightening, obsessional fantasies. Nothing will serve better to acquaint us with the hidden tragedy of certain unconscious mother-child relationships than the analysis of a perversion or an obsessional neurosis. For in such an analysis we witness the destructive power of the compulsion to repeat, and that compulsion's dumb, unconscious communication in the shaping of its drama. It is of eminent importance that although the patient has the possibility to experience the therapist as hostile to his drives, critical and contemptuous, yet the therapist should in fact never really be so. This may sound obvious, but it is not always in practice. Sometimes the therapist does just the opposite, quite unconsciously and with the best intentions. It may be that he can hardly bear being turned into a figure so hostile to instinctual drives, and so must demonstrate his tolerance by persuading the patient, for example, to describe his masturbatory practice fearlessly. In doing so, he will prevent the patient from experiencing his mother in the transference. At the same time, this therapist repeats, in reality, the mother's rejection of the patient's childish instinctual impulses, for he does not allow the childish fear and confusion to come out as they were originally felt, and will only speak to his patient on an adult level. One might, in fact, think of it as discrimination, as a devaluation of the childlike, when a therapist emphasizes that for him, of course, his patients are always adults and not children, as if being a child were something to be ashamed of and not something valuable that we lose later on. Occasionally one hears similar remarks about sickness, when a therapist is eager to consider his patients as healthy as possible, or warns them against dangerous regression, as if sickness were not sometimes the only possible way of expressing the true self. The people who come to us have, after all, been trying all their lives to be as adult and healthy, normal, as possible. They experience it as a great inner liberation when they discover this socially conditioned straitjacket of child rejection and normalcy worship within themselves and can give it up. A person who suffers under his perversion bears within himself his mother's rejection, and thus he flaunts his perversion in order to get others to reject him too, all the time, so re-externalizing the rejecting mother. For this reason, he feels compelled to do things that his circle and society disapprove of and despise. If society were suddenly to honor his form of perversion, as may happen in certain circles, he would have to change his compulsion, but it would not free him. What he needs is not permission to use one or another fetish, but the disgusted and horrified eyes. If he comes to therapy, he will look for this too, and will have to use all possible means to provoke the therapist's disgust, horror, and aversion. This provocation is, of course, a part of the transference, and from the incipient counter-transference reactions, one can surmise what happened at the beginning of his life. If the therapist can see through to the goals and compulsions behind this provocation, then the whole decayed building collapses and gives way to true, deep, and defenseless mourning. When finally the wound itself can be felt, there is no more necessity for all the distortions. This is a clear demonstration of how mistaken the attempt is to show a patient his instinctual conflicts if he has been trained from earliest childhood on to feel nothing. How can instinctual wishes and conflicts be experienced without feelings? What can orality mean without greed? What anality without defiance and envy? And what is the Oedipus complex without feelings of rage, abandonment, jealousy, loneliness, love? It is very striking to see how often pseudo-instinctual acting out ceases when the patient begins to experience his own feelings and can recognize his true instinctual wishes. The following citation is taken from a report about St. Pauli, Hamburg's red light district, that appeared in the German magazine Stern, June 8, 1978. You experience the masculine dream, as seductive as it is absurd, of being coddled by women like a baby and at the same time commanding them like a pasha. This masculine dream, indeed, is not absurd. It arises from the infant's most genuine and legitimate needs. Our world would be very different if the majority of babies had the chance to rule over their mothers like pashas and to be coddled by them without having to concern themselves with their mother's needs too early. The reporter asked some of the regular clients what gave them most pleasure in these establishments and summarized their answers as follows. That the girls are available and completely at the customer's disposal. They do not require protestations of love like girlfriends. There are no obligations, psychological dramas, nor pangs of conscience when desire has passed. You pay and are free. Even, and especially, the humiliation that such an encounter also involves for the client can increase stimulation, but that is less willingly mentioned. The humiliation, self-disgust, and self-contempt are intrapsychic reflections of the primary object's contempt, and through the compulsion to repeat, they produce the same tragic conditions for pleasure. Perversion is a borderline case, but gives us an understanding that is valid for the treatment of other disorders, namely, understanding of the great importance to be attached to unconscious, introjected contempt. What is unconscious cannot be abolished by proclamation or prohibition. One can, however, develop sensitivity toward recognizing it and can experience it consciously, and thus gain control over it. A mother can have the best intentions to respect her child, and yet be unable to do so, so long as she does not realize what deep shame she causes him with an ironic remark intended only to cover her own uncertainty. Indeed, she cannot be aware of how deeply humiliated, despised, and devalued her child feels if she herself has never consciously suffered these feelings, and if she tries to fend them off with irony. It can be the same in our psychoanalytic work. Certainly, psychoanalysts do not use words like bad, dirty, naughty, egotistic, rotten, but among themselves they speak of narcissistic, exhibitionistic, destructive, and regressive patients without noticing that they unconsciously give these words a pejorative meaning. It may be that in their abstract vocabulary, in their attitudes, even in the way they formulate their theories, they have something in common with a mother's contemptuous looks, which can be traced to the accommodating 3-year-old little girl within her. It is understandable that a patient's scornful attitude should induce a therapist to protect his superiority with the help of theory, but in such a dugout, the patient's true self will not pay us a visit. It will hide from us, just as it did from the mother's disgusted eyes. However, we make good use of our sensitivity. We can detect the successive installments in the story of a despised child that lies behind all the adult's expressions of contempt. When that happens, it is easier for the patient not to feel he is being attacked and to drop his inner need to hide behind his theories. The knowledge of theory is surely helpful, but only when it has lost its defensive function, when it is no longer the successor of a strict, controlling mother, forcing the therapist to accommodate himself and narrowing his possibilities. Then the knowledge of theory is like Winnicott's teddy bear, lying around, simply within reach when it is needed. It is very difficult to describe how a person has dealt with the contempt under which he has suffered as a child, especially the contempt for all his sensual enjoyment and pleasure in living, without giving concrete examples. With the aid of various models, one could certainly portray the dynamics, shifts in cathexis, structural changes, and various defense mechanisms, especially the defense against feeling. None of this, however, would communicate the emotional climate, which alone evokes a person's suffering, and so will make identification and empathy possible for the reader. With purely theoretical representations, we remain outside, can talk about the others, classify, group, and label them, and discuss them in a language only we understand totally. It is only through the concrete example of a specific life that we can show how a person has experienced the concrete naughtiness of his childhood as wickedness itself. Only the history of an individual life will make us realize how impossible it is for an individual to recognize his parents' compulsion as such once they have become part of himself, although he may try all his life to break out of this inner prison. In my dilemma between alienating theories and indiscretion, I have decided to use the example of the poet and novelist Hermann Hesse to demonstrate the very complicated situation. This eliminates from the beginning any moral evaluation, and although it does not concern a perversion, it does seem to me to have something in common with the early history of a perversion, namely the introjection of parental contempt for the child's instinctual needs. This example also has the advantage that it has been published, and published by the person himself, so that the connections that I shall postulate can be clarified with concrete examples from his life. At the beginning of his novel, Damien, Hermann Hesse describes the goodness and purity of a parental home that gave neither a place nor a hearing to a child's fibs. It is not difficult to recognize the author's own parental home in this novel, and he confirms this indirectly. Thus the child is left alone with his sin and feels that he is depraved, wicked, and outcast, though nobody scolds him, since nobody knows the terrible facts, and everyone shows him kindness and friendliness. Many people recognize this situation. The idealizing way of describing such a pure household is not strange to us either, and it reflects both the child's point of view and the hidden cruelty of educational methods that we know well. Like most parents, writes Hesse, mine were no help with the new problems of puberty, to which no reference was ever made. All they did was take endless trouble in supporting my hopeless attempts to deny reality and to continue dwelling in a childhood world that was becoming more and more unreal. I have no idea whether parents can be of help, and I do not blame mine. It was my own affair to come to terms with myself and to find my own way, and like most well-brought-up children, I managed it badly. To a child, his parents seem to be free of instinctual wishes, for they have means and possibilities of hiding their sexual satisfactions, whereas the child is always under surveillance. In his story, A Child's Heart, Hesse writes, "The adults acted as if the world were perfect, and as if they themselves were demigods. We children were nothing but scum. Again and again, after a few days, even after a few hours, something happened that should not have been allowed, something wretched, depressing, and shaming. Again and again, in the midst of the noblest and staunchest decisions and vows, I fell abruptly, inescapably, into sin and wickedness, into ordinary bad habits. Why was it this way?" The first part of Damien, it seems to me, is very evocative and easy to appreciate, even for people from quite different milieux. What makes the later parts of the novel so peculiarly difficult must be in some way related to Hesse's introjection of his parents' and grandparents' emotional values. They were missionary families, which is to be felt in many of his stories, but can perhaps most easily be shown in Damien. Although Sinclair has already had his own experience of cruelty, blackmail by an older boy, this has had no effect and gives him no key to a better understanding of the world. Wickedness, for him, is depravity. Here is the missionary's language. It is neither the hate, nor the ambivalence, nor the cruelty that are present in every human being, and that Sinclair himself has already experienced, but such trivialities as drinking in a tavern. The little boy, Hermann Hesse, took over from his parents this particular concept of wickedness as depravity. It is not rooted in his personality, but is like a foreign body. This is why everything in Damien that happens after the appearance of the god Abraxas, who is to unite the godly and the devilish, is so curiously removed it no longer touches us. Wickedness here is supposed to be artfully united with goodness. One has the impression that for the boy, this is something strange, threatening, and above all, unknown, from which he nevertheless cannot free himself because of his emotional cathexis of depravity, which is already joined to fear and guilt. Once more, I was trying most strenuously to construct an intimate world of light for myself out of the shambles of a period of devastation. Once more, I sacrificed everything within me to the aim of banishing darkness and evil from myself. In the Zurich exhibition, 1977, to commemorate the centenary of Hesse's birth, there was a picture with which the little Hermann grew up since it hung above his bed. In this picture, on the right, we see the good road to heaven, full of thorns, difficulties, and suffering. On the left, we see the easy, pleasurable road that inevitably leads to hell. Taverns play a prominent part on this road. The devout women probably hope to keep their husbands and sons away from these wicked places with this threatening representation. These taverns play an important role in Damien, too. This is particularly grotesque because Hesse had no urge at all to get drunk in such taverns, though he certainly did wish to break out of the narrowness of his parental system of values. Every child forms his first image of what is bad, quite concretely, by what is forbidden by his parents' prohibitions, taboos, and fears. He will have a long way to go until he can free himself from these parental values and discover his own badness in himself. He then will no longer regard it as depraved and wicked, because it is instinctual, but as an aspect of life from which no human being can be free at bottom, although the strength of their disavowal may be sufficient for some people to convince themselves that they are. Possibly, Hermann Hesse in his puberty also had to live out his father's split-off and denied depravity, and this he tried to portray in his books. Perhaps this is why there is so much in his novels that is not easy to empathize with, though it communicates the atmosphere under which Hesse suffered as a child and from which he could not free himself because he had been compelled to introject it so very early. The following passage from Damien shows how deeply the loss of the loved objects threatened Hesse's search for his true self. But where we have given of our love and respect, not from habit, but of our own free will, where we have been disciples and friends out of our inmost hearts, it is a bitter and horrible moment when we suddenly recognize that the current within us wants to pull us away from what is dearest to us. Then every thought that rejects the friend and mentor turns on our own hearts like a poisoned barb. Then each blow struck in defense flies back into one's own face. The words disloyalty and ingratitude strike the person who feels he was morally sound like catcalls and stigma, and the frightened heart flees timidly back to the charmed valleys of childhood virtues, unable to believe that this break too must be made, this bond also broken. And in a child's heart we read, "If I were to reduce all my feelings and their painful conflicts to a single name, I can think of no other word but dread. It was dread and uncertainty that I felt in all those hours of shattered childhood felicity. Dread of punishment, dread of my own conscience, dread of stirrings in my soul which I considered forbidden and criminal." In his story, A Child's Heart, Hesse portrays with great tenderness and understanding the feelings of an 11-year-old boy who had stolen some dried figs from his beloved father's room so that he could have in his possession something that belonged to his father. Guilt feelings, fear, and despair torment him in his loneliness and are replaced at last by the deepest humiliation and shame when his wicked deed is discovered. The strength of this portrayal leads us to surmise that it concerns a real episode from Hesse's own childhood. This surmise becomes certainty, thanks to a note made by his mother on November 11, 1889. Hermann's theft of figs discovered. From the entries in his mother's diary, and from the extensive exchange of letters between both parents and various members of the family, which have been available since 1966, it is possible to guess at the small boy's painful path. Hesse, like so many gifted children, was so difficult for his parents to bear, not despite, but because of his inner riches. Often a child's very gifts, his great intensity of feeling, depth of experience, curiosity, intelligence, quickness, and his ability to be critical, will confront his parents with conflicts that they have long sought to keep at bay with rules and regulations. These regulations must then be rescued at the cost of the child's development. All this can lead to the apparently paradoxical situation when parents who are proud of their gifted child and who even admire him are forced by their own distress to reject, suppress, or even destroy what is best because truest in that child. Two of Hesse's mother's observations may illustrate how this work of destruction can be combined with loving care. 1. 1881. Hermann is going to nursery school. His violent temperament causes us much distress. The child was 3 years old. 2. 1884. Things are going better with Hermann, whose education causes us so much distress and trouble. From the 21st of January to the 5th of June, he lived wholly in the boys' house and only spent Sundays with us. He behaved well there, but came home pale, thin, and depressed. The effects are decidedly good and salutary. He is much easier to manage now. The child was now 7 years old. On November 14, 1883, his father, Johannes Hesse, writes, Hermann, who was considered almost a model of good behavior in the boys' house, is sometimes hardly to be borne. Though it would be very humiliating for us, I am earnestly considering whether we should not place him in an institution or another household. We are too nervous and weak for him, and the whole household is too undisciplined and irregular. He seems to be gifted for everything. He observes the moon and the clouds, extemporizes for long periods on the harmonium, draws wonderful pictures with pencil or pen, can sing quite well when he wants to, and is never at a loss for a rhyme. In the strongly idealized picture of his childhood and his parents, which we encounter in Hermann Lauscher, Hesse has completely abandoned the original, rebellious, difficult, and for his parents, troublesome child he once was. He had no way to accommodate this important part of his self, and so was forced to expel it. Perhaps this is why his great and genuine longing for his true self remained unfulfilled. That Hermann Hesse was not deficient in courage, talent, or depth of feeling is of course evident in his works and in many of his letters, especially the strong letter from Stettin. But his father's answer to this letter, his mother's notes, and the passages from Damien and Kinderziel quoted above show us clearly how the crushing weight of his introjects became his fate. Despite his enormous acclaim and success, and despite the Nobel Prize, Hesse, in his mature years, suffered from the tragic and painful feeling of being separated from his true self, which doctors refer to curtly as depression. If we were to tell a patient that in other societies his perversion would not be a problem, that it is a problem here sheerly because it is our society that is sick and produces constrictions and constraints, this would certainly be partially true, but it would be of little help to him. He would feel, rather, that as an individual with his own individual history, he was being passed over and misunderstood. For this interpretation makes too little of his own very real tragedy. What most needs to be understood is his compulsion to repeat, and the state of affairs behind it to which this compulsion bears witness. All this, no doubt, is the result of social pressures, and these do not have their effect on his psyche through abstract knowledge, but are anchored in his earliest affective experience with his mother. His problems cannot be solved with words, but only through experience, not merely corrective experience as an adult, but above all through a reliving of his early fear of his beloved mother's contempt and his subsequent feelings of indignation and sadness. Mere words, however skilled the interpretation, will leave the split from which he suffers unchanged or even deepened. One can therefore hardly free a patient from the cruelty of his introjects by showing him how the absurdity, exploitation, and perversity of society causes our neuroses and perversions, however true this may be. Freud's patient Dora became sick because of society's sexual hypocrisy, which she was unable to see through. Things we can see through do not make us sick. They may arouse our indignation, anger, sadness, or feelings of impotence. What makes us sick are those things we cannot see through. Society's constraints that we have absorbed through our mother's eyes and an attitude from which no reading or learning can free us. To put it another way, our patients are intelligent. They read in newspapers and books about the absurdity of the armaments race, about exploitation through capitalism, diplomatic insincerity, the arrogance and manipulation of power, submission of the weak and the impotence of individuals, and they have thought about these subjects. What they do not see, because they cannot see it, is the absurdities of their own mothers at the time when they were still tiny children. One cannot remember one's parents' attitudes then, because one was a part of them. But in analysis, this early interaction can be recalled, and parental constraints are thus more easily disclosed. Political action can be fed by the unconscious anger of children who have been so abused, imprisoned, exploited, cramped, and drilled. This anger can be partially discharged in fighting our institutions without having to give up the idealization of one's own mother as one knew her in one's childhood. The old dependency can then be shifted to a new object. If, however, disillusionment and the resultant mourning can be lived through, then social and political disengagement do not usually follow, but the patient's actions are freed from the compulsion to repeat. The inner necessity to constantly build up new illusions and denials in order to avoid the experience of our own reality disappears once this reality has been faced and experienced. We then realize that all our lives we have feared and struggled to ward off something that really cannot happen any longer. It has already happened at the very beginning of our lives while we were completely dependent. The loneliness of the contemptuous. So long as one despises the other person and overvalues one's own achievements, he can't do what I can do, one does not have to mourn the fact that love is not forthcoming without achievement. Nevertheless, avoiding this mourning means that one remains at bottom the one who is despised. For I have to despise everything in myself that is not wonderful, good, and clever. Thus I perpetuate interpsychically the loneliness of childhood. I despise weakness, impotence, uncertainty, in short, the child in myself and in others. The patient seldom directly expresses his contempt for the therapist at the beginning of treatment. At first, his scorn is consciously directed at other people. He thinks, for example, I don't need any childish feelings. They are all right for my younger brothers and sisters who do not have my judgment. Anyway, it is only sentimental stuff, ridiculous. I am grown up. I can think and act. I can make changes in things around me. I don't need to feel helpless anymore or dependent. If I am afraid, I can do something about it or try to understand it intellectually. My intelligence is my most reliable companion. Well, all that sounds pretty good, but the person seeks therapy because he feels lonely, despite or even because of his clear superiority, and because he suffers from difficulties in making contacts, or perhaps suffers from compulsions or perversions. In the course of therapy, it can then be seen how far this contempt has protected him from his own feelings. Grandiose people often show contempt for their own true selves. Their scorn implies, without my high qualities, a person is completely worthless. That means further, without these achievements, these gifts, I could never be loved, would never have been loved. Thus the small, powerless child who is helplessly dependent on others, and also the awkward or difficult child, will have to suffer contempt. Grandiosity guarantees that the illusion continues. I was loved. Those whose grandiose false selves need to act out this certainty again and again are often envied or admired by those whose narcissistic disturbance has a primarily depressive structure, whereas the grandiose will despise the depressives. Nevertheless, there is no basis for a typology, since grandiosity and depression express the same underlying problem. Contempt as a rule will cease with the beginning of mourning for the irreversible that cannot be changed. For contempt, too, had in its own way served to deny the reality of the past. It is, after all, less painful to think that the others do not understand because they are too stupid. Then one can make efforts to explain things to them. There seems to be a way out, in fantasy at least. Through one's own grandiosity, power as such can be salvaged, and so the illusion of being understood, if only I can express myself properly, can be maintained. Devastating examples of this process are the works of Van Gogh and of the Swiss painter Max Gubler, who so wonderfully and so unsuccessfully courted the favor of their mothers with all the means at their disposal. If, however, this effort is relaxed, one is forced to see how little there was on the other side, and how much one had invested oneself. One must come to realize that each person is individually stamped by his own fate and his own childhood. Many parents cannot understand their child, since they too have been stamped by their experience with their own parents. It is indeed a great deal when parents can respect their children's feelings, even when they cannot understand them. A patient who had sought a second analysis because of tormenting obsessions repeatedly dreamed that he was on a lookout tower that stood in a swampy area at the edge of a town dear to him. From there he had a lovely view, but he felt sad and deserted. There was an elevator in the tower, and in the dream there were all kinds of difficulties over entrance tickets and obstacles on the way to this tower. In reality, the town had no such tower, but it belonged unequivocally to the patient's dream landscape, and he knew it well. The phallic meaning of this dream had been considered in his previous analysis, and it was certainly not wrong to see this aspect, though it was obviously not sufficient, since the dream recurred later with the same feelings of being deserted. Interpretation of instinctual conflict had absolutely no effect. The obsessional symptoms remained unchanged. Only after much had changed in the course of therapy were there new variations in the dream, too, and at last it changed in a decisive way. The patient first was surprised to dream that he already had entrance tickets, but the tower had been demolished, and there was no longer a view. Instead, he saw a bridge that joined the swampy district to the town. He could thus go on foot into the town and saw not everything, but some things close up. The patient, who suffered from an elevator phobia, was somehow relieved, for riding in this elevator had caused him considerable anxiety. Speaking of the dream, he said he was perhaps no longer dependent on always having a complete view, on always seeing everything, being on top and cleverer than other people. He could now go on foot, like everyone else. The patient was the more astonished when, toward the end of his therapy, he dreamed that he was suddenly sitting in this elevator in the tower again and was drawn upward as in a chairlift without feeling any fear. He enjoyed the ride, got out at the top, and strange to say, there was colorful life all about him. It was a plateau, and from it he had a view of the valleys. There was also a town up there with a bazaar full of colorful wares, a school where children were practicing ballet, and he could join in. This had been his childhood wish. And groups of people holding discussions with whom he sat and talked. He felt integrated into this society, just as he was. This dream impressed him deeply and made him happy. He said, "My earlier dreams of the tower showed my isolation and loneliness. At home, as the eldest, I was always ahead of my siblings. My parents could not match my intelligence, and in all intellectual matters I was alone. The town he loved was a European center of culture. On the one hand, I had to demonstrate my knowledge in order to be taken seriously, and on the other, I had to hide it, or my parents would say, 'Your studies are going to your head. Do you think you are better than everyone else just because you had the chance to study? Without your mother's sacrifice and your father's hard work, you would never have been able to do it.' That made me feel guilty, and I tried to hide my difference, my interests, and my gifts. I wanted to be like the others, but that would have meant being untrue to myself." So the patient had searched for his tower and had struggled with obstacles, on the way with entrance tickets, his fears, and more, and when he got to the top, he felt lonely and deserted. It is a well-known and common paradox that parents take up this grudging and competitive attitude toward their child and at the same time urge him on to the greatest achievement and are proud of his success. Thus the patient had to look for his tower and had to encounter obstacles too. In his therapy, he went through a revolt against this pressure toward achievement, and so the tower disappeared in the first of the dreams I have described here. He could give up his grandiose fantasy of seeing everything from above, and could look at things in his beloved town, into his self, from close by. The second dream came at a time when he first succeeded in expressing and experiencing himself in an artistic profession and was receiving a lively echo. This time he did not meet the proud and envious parent figures whom he feared, but true partners in a group. Thus ended not only his tower existence, but almost at the same time his contempt for others who were not so bright and quick, for instance in his first highly specialized profession. Only now did it become clear to him that he had felt compelled to isolate himself from others by means of his contempt, and at the same time was isolated and separated from his true self, at least from its helpless, uncertain part. The integration of this side of his personality put him in the way of a daring and very successful change of profession that gave him much happiness. And now, after 5 years of therapy, this patient could become aware of his fate with an intensity and richness of feeling perhaps no one could have suspected earlier in this scornful, distant, and intellectualizing man. Sexual perversions and obsessional neuroses are not the only possibilities of perpetuating the tragedy of early suffering from contempt. There are countless forms in which we may observe the fine nuances of this tragedy. The child in the adult is full of rage against his mother because she was not available to him and because she rejected some parts of his self. And this rage at first finds expression in the same form as that in which he felt rejected by his mother. There are many ways in which one may transmit the discrimination under which one has suffered as a child. There are people, for example, who never say a loud or angry word, who seem to be only good and noble, and who still give others the palpable feeling of being ridiculous or stupid or too noisy, at any rate too common compared with themselves. They do not know it and surely do not intend it, but this is what they radiate. They have introjected a parental attitude of which they have never been aware. The children of such parents find it particularly difficult to formulate any reproach in their therapy. Then there are the people who can be very friendly, perhaps a shade patronizing, but in whose presence one feels as if one were nothing. They convey the feeling that they are the only ones who exist, the only ones who have anything interesting or relevant to say. The others can only stand there and admire them in fascination, or turn away in disappointment and sorrow about their own lack of worth, unable to express themselves in these persons' presence. These people might be the children of grandiose parents, with whom these children had no hope of rivalry, and so later, as adults, they unconsciously pass on this atmosphere to those around them. Now those people who, as children, were intellectually far beyond their parents and therefore admired by them, but so also had to solve their own problems alone, will give us quite a different impression. These people will give us a feeling of their intellectual strength and willpower, and they also seem to demand that we too ought to fight off any feeling of weakness with intellectual means. In their presence, one feels one can't be recognized as a person with problems, just as they and their problems had not been recognized by their parents, for whom they always had to be strong. Keeping these examples in mind, it is easy to see why some professors, who are quite capable of expressing themselves clearly, will use such complicated and convoluted language when they present their ideas that their students can only acquire them in a fog of anger and diligence without being able to make much use of them. These students, then, may well have the same sorts of feelings that their teacher once had and was forced to suppress in relation to his parents. If the students themselves become teachers one day, they will have the opportunity of handing on this unusable knowledge, like a pearl of great price, because it had cost them so much. It greatly aids the success of therapeutic work when the patient can become aware of the inner objects that work within him. Here's an example. At a certain point in her therapy, a patient suddenly began to help her very intelligent 10-year-old daughter with her schoolwork, although the girl had never had any difficulty in doing it alone. The patient's conscious motive was a bit of general advice from the teacher at a parent-teacher meeting. The child soon lost her spontaneity in learning, became unsure of herself, and actually began to have difficulty with her schoolwork. Now the patient's continued supervision of her daughter's homework was fully justified. The patient's own mother, a teacher, had been very proud of her pedagogic talent. She could, as she put it, make something out of any child. She was one of those unsure mothers who would even teach their children to walk and talk if they could. By then, both the patient and I knew this, for the patient had repeatedly experienced her mother and me in the transference, and she had fantasized that I was less concerned with her than with my own success and the confirmation of my own value in wanting her therapy to turn out well. Thereafter, she had remembered and experienced in her dreams scenes with her mother that confirmed these feelings. But that did not suffice. The patient also needed to discover her mother in herself, had to see how she had become so afraid, quite unrealistically, that her daughter would compromise her in her ability as a mother before the teacher. She hated her own compulsion to meddle in her daughter's life, and experienced it as something foreign to her nature, but she could not give up this need to supervise the child. At last she found help through her dreams, in which she felt that she herself was in her mother's situation during the post-war period. Now she was able to imagine how it had been for her mother, who had been widowed early and had had to make her own way for herself and her daughter, and apparently also had to contend with public opinion, which had it that because she went out to work, she was neglecting her daughter. Her only child, my patient, had therefore to be the more perfect. The family constellation in the daughter's case was quite different, however, and the need to supervise her child disappeared when my patient realized this difference. I am a different person, and my fate is different from that of my mother, she once said. As a result, not only the teacher, but also her husband and neighbors spontaneously stopped giving her good advice and veiled orders. There are moments in every therapy when dammed-up demands, fears, criticism, or envy break through for the first time. With amazing regularity, these impulses appear in a guise that the patient has never expected, or that he might even have rejected and feared all his life. Before he can develop his own form of criticism, he first adopts his father's hated vocabulary or nagging manner, and the long repressed anxiety will surface in, of all things, his mother's irritating hypochondriacal fears. It is as if the badness in the parents that had caused a person the most suffering in his childhood and that he had always wanted to shun has to be discovered within himself so that reconciliation will become possible. Perhaps this also is part of the never-ending work of mourning, that this personal stamp must be accepted as part of one's own fate before one can become at least partially free. When the patient has truly emotionally worked through the history of his childhood and thus regained his sense of being alive, then the goal of the therapy has been reached. Afterward, it is up to the patient whether he will take a regular job or not, whether he wants to live alone or with a partner, whether he wants to join a political party, and if so, which one. All that is his own decision. His life story, his experiences, and what he has learned from them will all play a role in how he will live. It is not the task of the therapy to socialize him or to bring him up, not even politically, for every form of bringing up denies his autonomy, nor to make friendships possible for him. All that is his own affair. When the patient has consciously, repeatedly felt, and not only learned from interpretations, how the whole process of his bringing up did manipulate him in his childhood, and what desires for revenge this has left him with, then he will see through manipulation quicker than before, and will himself have less need to manipulate others. Such a patient will be able to join groups without again becoming helplessly dependent or bound, for he has gone through the helplessness and dependency of his childhood in the transference. He will be in less danger of idealizing people or systems if he has realized clearly enough how as a child he had taken every word uttered by mother or father for the deepest wisdom. He may experience, however, while listening to a lecture or reading a book, the same old childish fascination and admiration, but he will recognize at the same time the underlying emptiness or human tragedy that lurks behind these words and shudder at it. Such a person cannot be tricked with fascinating, incomprehensible words, since he has matured through his own experience. Finally, a person who has consciously worked through the whole tragedy of his own fate will recognize another's suffering more clearly and quickly, though the other may still have to try to hide it. He will not be scornful of others' feelings, whatever their nature, because he can take his own feelings seriously. He surely will not help to keep the vicious circle of contempt turning. All these things are not demands I make on my patients because of my own wishes or ideology. They are simply the result of the experience that I have gained through my work with my patients, and that can be attributed to the effects of their regained sense of being truly alive.